I've mentioned many times on this channel before that I was doing film studies for one of my A-levels. Now the reason for why I constantly brought it up wasn't because I wanted to be a show-off or anything like that. It's not like I was trying to make it out like my opinion was better than yours or something. I did it more so because I thought you guys might find it interesting to hear that fact, particularly whenever I talked about a film which I actually studied in depth in class. However, now that some time has passed, I have now fully completed my A-levels, hence why uploads have been slow recently, and I thought that, to celebrate this milestone, it could be fun to rank every film which I studied in my class. I just think that this can be an interesting way to hear my in-depth thoughts on the types of films chosen for an academic curriculum, and I can also use this as a way to not only discuss my thoughts on the films themselves, but to also talk about my experience of studying them and any funny stories I have related to that. To be honest, I think that hearing my opinions on these films could be quite interesting, as my experience with them is likely radically different from most of you lot, as I've got a completely unique perspective due to the fact that I had to study and write about them for exams. I don't know, I just think that this will be a cool little video. It's definitely quite niche and personal to me, but I don't really care. Now, this is going to be a much longer and more detailed video than my previous monthly rankings, so I'm going to have to keep this introduction relatively brief and just go over the basics that you need to know before watching. So, first of all, what is actually going to be covered in this video? Well, I'm only going to talk about the main 11 films which I had to write about in an exam. There were still a few additional films which we saw in class, such as Psycho and The Devil's Backbone, as well as some short films like The Gunfighter for example. However, I'm not going to talk about any of them, as I instead want to stick to the main films that we had to officially study, mostly for simplicity's sake. As for what I studied and why I studied them, I'm going to quickly go through that by running through the context related to the academic curriculum that I had to follow. So basically, this curriculum is split into two main components. Component 1 featured your mainstream traditional English speaking movies from the US and UK, whereas Component 2 contains the niche films which are often in a foreign language or through a completely different medium, such as silent cinema or documentaries. This was done so that one exam paper would be able to exclusively focus on one component. These two components also have specific categories included within them, which would correlate with one question on the paper which would exclusively focus on that category. For Component 1 there was a category on Hollywood films, and for that we studied Casablanca by Michael Curtiz for classical Hollywood and Bonnie and Clyde by Arthur Penn for new Hollywood. Then there's the contemporary American stuff where we studied Christopher Nolan's Inception for a mainstream film and Matt Russell's Captain Fantastic for an indie film. And finally there's British cinema, where we ended up studying Fish Tank and Sweet 16 by Andrea Arnold and Ken Loach respectively. As for Component 2, it started off with global cinema, where we studied Guillermo del Toro's Pan's Labyrinth for a European film, and Wild Tales by Damien Zivron, I probably butchered that, for a film outside of Europe. And then there are also a few categories where we only studied one film instead of two. This included silent cinema with F.W. Murnau's Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans, documentary cinema with Sarah Polley's Stories We Tell, and experimental cinema with Jean-Luc Godard's Vivre sa vie. And those are all 11 films that I'm going to cover in this video, and now you know how they fit into the curriculum as well. But, before I start ranking them all, I've got a few ground rules which I need to run through. First things first, I'm ranking these films as films first and foremost. Yes, I will talk about the experience of watching and studying them in class, but this ranking is not reflective of how I felt about the experience. I'm purely basing it all off of my current opinions on the films, which I got from my latest rewatch of them all back in May. On a similar topic, this video is entirely my opinion. I know that some of these opinions will annoy some of you, and that's okay. Feel free to disagree in the comments below, but please respect what I have to say. And the final thing to note is that this video will contain spoilers on every film. In order for me to fully express and explain all of my opinions, I'm going to need to discuss spoilery moments and plot beats. As a result of this, I decided to put timestamps for each segment in the description below. If you don't want to be spoiled by a film, then I recommend just skipping ahead to the next segment using these timecodes. Right, I think that's everything now. So without further dilly-dally, let's jump straight into this ranking, starting off with the films which well, you'll see what I thought of them.
I don't like it very much.
So, what is my least favourite movie on this list? Considering the fact that this is for an academic study, you would assume that all of the movies on this list are of high quality and are reasonably popular at the very least. And you're right, all of these movies are popular, with certain demographics. So that should mean that it was really hard for me to choose a bottom spot, right? No, it was the easiest one to choose from this entire list because this is the one and only movie which I just did not like at all. And the thing is, I can't really justify calling it simply a not for me movie, because that implies I understand what the movie was actually going for, and can appreciate it somewhat. With this one, meanwhile, there was so much I found myself criticising about it that it got to the point that I would dare call this film actually kinda bad. Yeah, this is going to be a real hot take, and I'm already prepared for all the hate comments. Although, to be fair, this is a movie which I'm certain that 0% of my casual audience has seen, so I'm only going to be pissing off the newbies who also happen to be really pretentious cinephiles. So, without further ado, I do not like Vera Savae. At all. I think that it is pretentious, boring, messy, and ultimately pointless, and I got virtually no enjoyment out of it whatsoever, and would happily never watch it again. So, why do I dislike it so much? Well, in order to explain my thoughts, I need to discuss a certain Jean-Luc Godard, because he's the most crucial part of this film, hence why the exam question was on him as an auteur. Now, for the purposes of being as fair as possible in this video, I actually went to the effort to watch 2 additional Godard movies before scripting this segment. I checked out Breathless, because we watched bits of it in class and it kind of seemed like the quintessential Godard film, and I also saw Alphaville, because it's something quite different from the other 2 Godard films I saw. I also wanted to watch Band of Outsiders as well, but I didn't have time to see it before making this video. I have seen the dance scene though, because, well, obviously. Anyway, between the 3 films that I saw, I feel like I've got a good understanding of Godard's style and what he's trying to go for, and so I think it's fair for me to give the opinion that Jean-Luc Godard is the most overrated director I have ever watched the films for, and it's not even close. It's not even a case of he's a director just not for me, unlike David Lynch, because I at least respect and appreciate Lynch despite his weirdness not being my cup of tea. Godard, meanwhile, nah, I don't like him at all. Like seriously, why is he hailed as one of the greatest directors of all time when Francois Truffaut is just him but better? And I'm saying this as someone who has only seen one Truffaut movie. Okay, let's rein things back a little bit. What is it about Godard that I don't like? Well, the problem that I have with him is the fact that he is a director who prides himself on being different and experimental. But everything he does is really poorly done, and so it does nothing for me except for make him look really pretentious, as if he thinks he's smarter than he actually is. In my opinion, he is the most style over substance director of all time, and I'm saying this as a Wes Anderson fan. I don't care, The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou has more going for it than the 3 Godard films I saw combined. Yes, even Alphaville. Either way, let's talk about this style that he has. So for those who don't know, Godard is seen as one of the pioneers of the French New Wave of cinema, which is one of the most important checkmarks in film history as it marked a clear instance of independent creators and experimentation, which will directly influence the new Hollywood era that I'll discuss later. Many of the techniques used by French New Wave directors were pretty uncommon at the time, such as the use of location filming and handheld cameras and whatnot. But a lot of the really experimental techniques were primarily used by Godard, with examples including his famous jump cuts. He was really the first director to primarily use them, and that eventually inspired later Hollywood films to employ the same techniques afterwards. But the jump cuts are a good example of my first problem with Godard. He may have been the first person to primarily use jump cuts, but that doesn't mean that they were used well. Oh my goodness, the editing in Breathless is some of the worst I've ever seen. Look at this shit! All of the jump cuts do nothing but leave me absolutely confused over anything that's going on. Yes, Godard was being experimental by breaking rules like the 180-degree rule, but they're rules for a reason. Yes, the rules can be broken effectively, but this isn't how you do it, and I don't think it's fair to give it a free pass just because it was the first time that it was used. From a modern perspective, I just can't go back to this film. It's way too jarring and messy for me. I once heard someone describe the editing here as akin to a 12-year-old discovering Premiere Pro for the first time, and that is seriously the best description that I can think of because it is just so true. And this is just one of many quote-unquote experimental techniques that Godard used, which were just really poorly executed for me. But we'll talk about some other ones later. But the big problem with Godard is the fact that, for me at least, these experimentations seem to be the only things that the films have going for them. Outside of them, there's nothing else to latch onto. The characters are incredibly flat and uninteresting, the stories are either non-existent or find themselves taking a backseat, and any interesting theme isn't integrated naturally, as instead simply told to the audience by the characters in their incredibly unnatural feeling conversations. This is why I didn't even like Alphaville despite having a hell of a lot more substance to it than the other 2 films I saw. Any interesting theme of identity is just told to the audience, and I can't immerse myself in the story because the characters are so dull. Therefore, I found every Godard film I saw incredibly boring. Alphaville especially nearly made me fall asleep, and Breathless was only slightly saved by a couple of funny moments.
Michel. Pisser dans le lavabo.
If that was an actual line, what the hell? If that was a mistranslation, that is the greatest mistranslation I've ever seen in my life. Like, what the hell? How did you get here? So yeah, it's clear that I don't like Goddard very much, and I truly think that Vivre sa vie is the perfect encapsulation of everything that I don't like about him. Hence, why it's my least favourite of the 3 films I saw. As I said in the introduction, this film is the token experimental film that we had to study, but nothing experimental that this film does is actually good. Well, okay, almost nothing. I did actually like how the editing is somewhat normal here, as in, I could actually work out what was going on. In fact, in spite of its relative normality, the editing was sometimes actually pretty cool. I specifically like the way the jump cuts were used during the gunfire scene where I made the camera go all do-do-do-do-do-do. That was really nice. But all things considered, the camera was pretty static throughout most of this film, so there weren't many opportunities for the editing to give me a headache, which was definitely nice to see. However, whilst the editing was alright, there's so many other experimental techniques used that I can criticise for their sheer pointlessness. For example, there's this scene near the end of the film where the dialogue is muted for some reason. I don't really know why. And then there's the whole structure of the film, which is separated into 12 different chapters. Again, I don't really know why it's like this, to be honest, as each segment feels virtually identical to each other, and none of them have anything interesting going on. I'm probably going to get killed for saying this, but Tarantino used chapters better in Inglourious Basterds, as each chapter had a distinct feel to them, you know? I mean, yeah, his chapters were kind of pointless in The Hateful Eight, and maybe even Kill Bill as well, but there's at least one instance where Tarantino did something better than Goddard, as the chapters felt essential to the structure of the film. Here though, the chapters were just an intrusive way of setting up each new scene, and establishing shots would have been so much better. And then there's the scene which actively pisses me off the most. The fucking letter scene! In this scene, Nana is writing a letter to someone where she describes her looks so that she can become a prostitute. Oh yeah, I probably should have told you all what the plot was. Who cares? No one watches Goddard movies for the plot, let's be honest here. Anywho, she writes a letter in the scene, and that's pretty much all she does. Well, I suppose she does measure herself at one point, but outside of that, she's mostly just writing this letter. And this is a 4-minute long, uncut scene. What the hell? Why in the sweet name of the Eiffel Tower did we need to see all of that? It added no value to my life whatsoever. There is absolutely no thematic or narrative reason for us to see the whole process of Nana writing a letter, when it could have been cut down with a voiceover. You know, like a normal movie. Oh, but it's more realistic. Doesn't make it interesting though, does it? As it's still one of the most worthless and boring scenes that I have ever seen, and is a perfect example of why something being experimental doesn't automatically make it good. And to go alongside that, it also feels really out of place here, because it's quite well known that the French New Wave were able to shave down runtimes due to the fact that they cut out unimportant scenes. This meant that these films didn't have to show or tell, and could instead go straight to the important narrative details, and Goddard did this all the time. I mean, the jump cuts are a clear example of him cutting down anything unimportant to the point that it looks like a YouTube vlog. So, if he's perfectly okay with cutting things down, why did he decide to unnecessarily drag out this scene? Mate, you can't even stay consistent with your style, come on man. But the big issue for me, which permeates throughout this entire film, is the fact that Vivre sa vie was designed with the intention of the audience not immersing themselves into the film. Basically, Goddard used these Brechtian techniques in order to alienate the audience from the characters, which would thus prevent them from feeling emotionally attached to them. This can most obviously be seen through the fact that the characters such as Nana have no personality whatsoever, but even the direction reflects this, such as with the famous back of the head shots, which thus prevent the audience from being able to read Nana's face. So, the film was straight up created in a way so the audience can't immerse themselves into what they're watching. Question: how is one meant to give a shit about what's happening in a film if they're literally not allowed to be engaged with it? That's just... I don't have the words. That makes literally no sense to me whatsoever. So yeah, I wasn't able to click with this film because I didn't care about what was happening because I couldn't give a shit about the story and characters. And that was the point? I'm sorry, throw every excuse you want at me, I just think that's a terrible idea and I'm not giving it a free pass just because it's unique. So yeah, it's clear that I did not care for anything that this film was attempting to do. But do you want to know the real reason for why I've got such a disdain for this movie? It's because of how openly misogynistic it is. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but Goddard and women don't really go together. His films feel very I don't know how to put it, but they feel off whenever they talk about women, and the way that Goddard writes female characters makes Christopher Nolan look like Greta Gerwig. It ain't great. But Vivre sa Vie takes this to a whole nother level. Not only does it tell a slightly uncomfortable story about prostitution which ends in an utterly miserable way when Nana is unceremoniously killed, alright, but the mere inception of the film will leave you feeling kind of icky. Basically, the actress who played Nana is Anna Karenina, who was, for a time, married to Goddard. Their marriage was strange, to say the least. Why? Well, because Goddard admitted that he could only love his wife through the lens of a camera, and so created Vivre sa Vie as a way to portray his wife as this sort of painting akin to Edgar Allan Poe's The Oval Portrait. Have any of you ever heard of the term the male gaze? Because that's literally what this film is. Hearing this fact just made me feel so uncomfortable, to be honest, and this feeling is made worse when you learn that Karenina was so unhappy in her marriage with Goddard that she tried to kill herself. Goddard, you don't deserve Anna Karenina, you misogynistic prick. Yeah, if you're wondering why I was being so harsh on Goddard, it's because he's a terrible person and I don't feel bad for dissing him. Now, usually I can look past dated aspects of a film, and there's evidence of me doing that later in this ranking, but because the misogyny is such an integral part of this film's identity, I can't really do that here, unfortunately. But even putting all the misogyny aside, a film where the appeal is based entirely off of an actress's good looks is definitely not going to work for me, because I'm the kind of guy who cares more about personality. Yes, Anna Karenina is definitely attractive, however I'm not going to like the film for voyeurism, because I'd much rather learn about her personality. That's what would make me attracted to her. Although she does love films, to be fair. Okay, all joking apart, the feelings that this movie gives me are not great, to be honest, and so I find the film deeply unpleasant to watch as a result. I really hoped that learning more about this film would make me like it more, but it actually just did the opposite and made me like it less because I was more aware of Goddard's dodgy nature. Yeah, I just don't like this film at all. But I am nothing if not a fair critic. This is not a terrible movie by any means, as there are some good parts to it. As I said, I like that one instance of funky editing, but alongside that, the cinematography is fantastic. I may not like Goddard very much, but damn it, his movies look absolutely brilliant. Now, I don't think Vivre sa Vie quite tops Alphaville in terms of cinematography, but it's still very nice. I do also think that some of the experimental techniques are actually quite strong here, in spite of their weak execution. I'm specifically referring to the back of the headshots used in this movie. Using that technique as a way to hide emotion and distance an audience from a character is honestly genius, and, when used well, it can be very effective. Hell, it's such a good technique that even I, the guy who just spent however long dissing Goddard, used that technique in my own short film I made for coursework. It's just a really good piece of filmmaking, and thanks to stuff like that, I can definitely understand why later directors like Scorsese and Tarantino were inspired so much by Goddard's work, as the blueprints for something truly great were here. These later directors just adapted it in a much better way though, in my opinion. But my final positive with this film is that there are actually quite a few scenes that I genuinely really liked. The philosophical debate near the end of the film was quite interesting, to be honest. The scene where Nana danced and the bloke made weird balloon noises was pretty funny, and I especially loved the Passion of Joan of Arc scene. Not only was it a nice way to show both Goddard and Nana's love for the cinema, but it was also a clever and more natural feeling way to reflect the main theme of the film, all about lending yourself to others and giving yourself to yourself. Joan of Arc and Nana both do something similar to each other by putting themselves at risk, and eventually dying, in order to achieve their own personal goal, and I thought that the parallel between them was actually quite clever. It's also the only time in the film that I actually felt any kind of emotion or investment whatsoever, although maybe that's just because the original Passion of Joan of Arc is bloody good, but whatever. So yeah, there were some things that I did actually like here, but overall I just got so little out of this movie. I found it really pretentious and dull, and I firmly believe that if Goddard movies were made in exactly the same way today, they would be written off as no better than student films which think they are so deep, when they're really not. The best possible comparison that I can make to Vivre sa Vie is that painting from the Inside No. 9 episode, A Quiet Night In. There's nothing to it whatsoever, yet it's valued as this priceless work of art. But in reality, you could replace it with something like Kitchen Roll and no one would notice. To be brutally honest, Plan 9 from Outer Space was unironically better than Vivre sa Vie, because at least it felt genuine, and at least I could see what it was going for. Also, there's extra bonus points for the fact that it's actually an entertaining and enjoyable watch, which just makes me love it to bits. With Vivre sa Vie though, I have not found a single person under the age of 55 who actually loves this movie, and I think that just shows that it really hasn't held up over time. In saying all of that though, if you love this movie for legitimate reasons, then I'd love to hear why in the comments below. I'm always open to alternative opinions, and I'm certain that there's something I missed here, so feel free to say it all down below. For now though, let's move away from this onto the films which I don't actually dislike. Although to be fair, I'm still not mad on a couple of them.
Pierre, you are the father!
Alright, so out of all of the films on this list, I can confidently say that the one film which is just simply not for me is Stories We Tell. And there's a lot of reasons for why, and I'm just going to go straight into it instead of dilly-dallying with this intro. First things first, it's a documentary. And I just realised that this is actually the very first documentary I'm ever going to be talking about on this channel. Huh, that's pretty cool. Anyway, I don't have anything against documentaries on principle. They're an important medium in filmmaking and they are absolutely worth studying in an academic course. But I'm not really much of a documentary guy, to be honest. Unless Philomena Kunk is presenting it or the subject matter really interests me, I'm never usually going to be able to engage myself much in a documentary. I'm sorry, that's just how I am. Therefore, it's no surprise that Stories We Tell didn't work for me right out of the gate, as not only is it a documentary, but its subject matter is very specific, and to be brutally honest, I just didn't really care much about it. Basically, this documentary is all about Sarah Polley finding out more about her late mother, Diane Polley. Except it's not about that. It starts out that way, but it eventually changes into the plot of Mamma Mia. And I'm not even joking when I say that. It's literally Sarah trying to figure out who her biological father is between Michael Polley and Harry Gulkin. By the way, just for context reasons, Harry was her true father, but Michael was the father who stepped up. I don't know about you, but to me, that is literally the plot of Mamma Mia. Like, what's going on here? But yeah, whilst that may sound like an interesting premise, I just couldn't really get into the story of this documentary, because I honestly couldn't give a shit about this one woman's family. Like, I don't know Sarah, so why should I care about her parentage? Now, if this was a fictional, story-driven traditional movie, I'd probably be able to get into it a lot more as it could be structured in a more engaging way. But because it's a documentary, it is naturally a lot slower paced and is delivered in a way to provide information to the audience, rather than telling a story with different peaks and valleys in its narrative beats. This approach works for an expository documentary, which is also quite reflexive as well. However, if you're someone like me who doesn't care much about the information being provided, it's hard to fully immerse yourself into what you're being shown, as you're just left wondering why you should care so much. As I said though, this is an entirely personal thing. I know that a lot of other people in my class got really into this one, and more power to them. For me though, I just couldn't get into it no matter how hard I tried. It was just too personal and specifically focused on this one topic, which I couldn't even pretend to be interested in, for me to really get engaged. Oh, and side note, I really don't like how Sarah claims that Stories We Tell is not a personal documentary. Sarah, it's a documentary about your family, and your struggles with trying to find your father. It doesn't get much more personal than that. And no, it's not like the narrative is relatable to a wider general audience, because let's be honest here, most audience members know who their dad is. It will only be relatable to a very small community of people. Let's put my issue with this statement into perspective. Sarah's comment is the equivalent of me saying that this video that you're watching now isn't a personal video, despite the fact that it's specifically focused on my class and was largely made for me and any of my classmates who may or may not be watching. Yes, other people can enjoy it as well, but it's still very personal to me. Now, to be fair, this point isn't a problem with the documentary itself, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with making a more personal documentary, but Sarah's comment always just kinda bugged me and I wanted to mention it briefly. So yeah, I struggled to really engage myself with this film because of my personal preferences, but sadly that wasn't all that I took issue with in regards to Stories We Tell. To be honest, there are a lot of creative decisions which I just didn't really like the inclusion of. This is specifically in relation to the way that Michael Polley was used. For some reason, this film decided to make Michael the narrator of the documentary, despite the fact that he's already being interviewed in the talking head segment. I don't know about you, but I just found that to be a really confusing and awkward decision, especially whenever Michael would talk about himself in the third person as a result of his narration. I just didn't really see the point in having him do it when his talking head segment was fine as is. I personally think that Sarah would have been a more fitting narrator, seeing as she's the director and obviously doesn't interview herself. Normally I would say to hire someone else, but I think it's clear that Sarah wanted a narrator who was personally linked to the film itself, which does make sense to be fair, but I just don't think that the person in question should have been Michael. I think Sarah would have worked a lot better. Oh, and speaking of Michael's narration, I really didn't like the constant acknowledgement of the production of this documentary. Now, I didn't mind the odd shot which included the camera crew or something, that was fine, but I really didn't like the parts where they would show Sarah telling Michael to redo a bit of narration. What was actually the point of that? The teacher said that it made the documentary more reflexive or something, but I still didn't get the point of it. For me, it didn't make the documentary deeper or more interesting or anything, and instead just took me out of the immersion and wasted my time. Oh, and speaking of immersion, another reason for why I found it so hard to connect with and care about this documentary was because it really didn't give you time to immerse yourself in it. The audience is just kinda chucked into the interviews without much initial information. This is a problem because so many people are introduced at once, and I have no idea who any of them are or what their relationship to Diane is. I mean, I suppose you can kinda figure out who's who as you continue to watch this documentary, but that just makes the viewing experience 10 times harder and less immersive. Plus, it also meant that I often found myself really confused at various points. Like, in the middle of the film, they talk about Diane's ex-husband, and how he kinda screws her over in a way by taking away her first 2 children. And when that was being discussed, my first thought was, wait, she had a husband before Michael? Now, I'm certain that this fact was probably mentioned before this point, but because very little attention was drawn to it, I never picked up on that fact, even on a rewatch. Honestly, a simple little annotation under the names of each person, which explains their relation to Diane, would have gone a long way, and would have saved me the effort of having to draw an entire family tree to try and figure out who's who. And the final issue that I have with this film regards the pacing. Seriously, why did this have to be nearly 2 hours long? Documentaries are already slower paced than narrative driven films as is. You really didn't need to drag it out further, especially when I can confidently call a lot of this movie kinda fillery. There's so many scenes and plot points which just don't really go anywhere, and by the final third, it feels like all the interviewees are doing are explaining the themes of the documentary. Come on, we didn't need that, we could pick it up ourselves. So yeah, between my lack of immersion or interest alongside the absurdly inflated runtime, I was just left kinda bored with this film, and it's something I'll probably never watch again. In fact, let's put my opinion on this film into perspective. During the study of this film in class, we also watched the first 20 minutes of Bowling for Columbine by Michael Moore, and we did that just in case we answered a question about different documentary theories. And I personally preferred those 20 minutes to the entirety of Stories We Tell. The subject matter was more interesting, the presentation was a lot clearer, and it was also more entertaining I feel because, like him or not, Michael Moore is a funny guy. Yes, Stories We Tell had some entertaining moments here and there, but it was mostly just kinda dull for me. So yeah, it's clear that I wasn't big on this film. But, it is still better than Viva Savie, largely because I still felt like this film had a point to it, even if I couldn't personally engage myself with it. I do think that the main theme present here, all about how you can never truly believe what one person says about something, was a really strong one which was executed in a very unique way. Instead of just interviewing different people to hear their differing perspectives on Diane, Sarah actually goes the extra mile and recreates what is being said through Super 8 footage. Yeah, all of this Super 8 footage that you're seeing is actually fake. Okay, to be fair, I imagine that some of the Super 8 footage near the start is probably real, but as the film goes on, it becomes more and more clear that most of the footage here is actually staged, and the audience is being tricked into believing what they are being shown. Although to be fair, this fact is kinda obvious, especially in the moment where Harry meets Sally to reveal that he's her father. Wait, did I just say Harry meets Sally? No, Harry meets Sarah! God, I'm an idiot. No normal person would get someone to record this meeting on a Super 8 camera, so it was obviously recreated to accompany the visuals. But some other examples of staged footage are a lot less obvious, such as the funeral scene which Harry claimed to be a part of in spite of Michael's confusion, where the footage zooms in on Harry to validate his point. This wouldn't normally happen at a recording of a funeral. Hell, funerals are unlikely to be recorded in the first place. But the footage was created anyway to essentially manipulate the audience into believing Harry's story. It is explicitly stated in the film that Sarah wanted to give every person equal validity in the stories they tell about Diane, hence the title, and in order to achieve that, she used authentic looking Super 8 footage to validate everyone's stories in spite of any contradiction. And these contradictions leave the audience without a clear idea of what truly happened, which shows that no one person's perspective is the absolute truth. It's all just stories in the end. Forgive me for all the specific examples that I used, my exam question on this film was based on how Sarah manipulates her audience, so these examples were just burned into my brain, and I just had to find a way to use them again. Anywho, I just thought that these were some fascinating ideas present which helped to give this film a lot more substance. And it was also just a really unique way to present a documentary, and the Super 8 made the experience a lot more visually interesting. honestly, I don't think there's anything wrong with this film on a purely technical level, outside the length. Its ideas were great on paper, and they were executed in a brilliant way. As I said, it was mostly just personal preferences in relation to my middling opinions on this documentary as a whole, as well as some of the creative decisions which I just couldn't get behind. Still, Stories We Tell is worth a watch because it definitely isn't bad by any means. It's just simply not for me, which left me feeling kinda bored on the whole. Sorry if this opinion annoys some of you. Luckily, we are done with the only two films I either disliked or found mediocre, so they're probably the only opinions which will annoy some people. The rest of these films, meanwhile, are good at the bare minimum, although that doesn't necessarily mean that I particularly want to watch them again. Case in point,
the UK has an insane pedo density. Do you know what I mean? There is so many pedos in this fucking country. There is so many.
What did you say? Pedo density?
Fish Tank is the worst kind of movie that you could possibly watch in a school environment. It is so uncomfortable and so awkward to the point that I think I'd rather watch Come and See in class. I really mean that. But let's rein things back a bit, shall we? Fish Tank is one of the 2 British films that we had to study, and it is specifically defined as being a British social realist film. That means that the narrative follows realistic people going through struggles in a real-world environment. As a result, there's not really much of a plot to go off of here, as it's more so reliant on its social themes of poverty. But because there's no clear narrative, it's a bit hard for me to figure out where the best place to start with this film is. So I'll just immediately answer the question of, is Fish Tank a good movie? Yes, I would definitely say so, and I certainly had less flaws of it than Stories We Tell, which is why I ranked it above. But, in a similar vein to Stories We Tell, I think the film has been placed near the bottom of this ranking entirely because of some personal issues I had with watching it. And yes, these issues are specifically related to the uncomfortable nature of the film and the class environment that I had to watch it in. I'm sorry, but I don't particularly enjoy watching a film where a 15-year-old gets cucked by Michael Fassbender. It's gross enough as is, and it's made even worse by having to watch these scenes with 20 other people. Just think of the most awkward and uncomfortable school lesson that you've ever had, and double it. That's what watching some of these scenes in a class environment felt like. To be brutally honest, I think I preferred the lesson where I passed out in the middle of class and hit my head on a desk Chuck McGill style to the lesson where we watched the sex scene between Mia and Connor. It was that awkward and uncomfortable. And yes, before you ask, that story about passing out in class was true, and I do stand by my opinion that it was the better day. Now, I know someone is going to immediately jump in and say that, you know, the film was meant to be uncomfortable. Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. But, for me personally, even putting aside all the stuff related to the class environment, there are some themes in films which I just hate seeing, which thus means that I avoid films related to them like the plague. Some of these themes which I can't really handle are things like paedophilia or rape or anything like that. Basically, any sexually related crime I can't deal with. I don't care how well done the film is, it is something I'd rather not watch, and even if I do watch it, I won't ever rewatch the film because it is just too miserable for me to want to go near it again. You're not supposed to enjoy these films obviously, but I vastly prefer being entertained by a film rather than being left absolutely miserable. That's why none of my favourite films are too depressing, and even if they are more serious, they usually have comedic moments of levity to them. This is also the reason for why, despite how well made it is, I couldn't bring myself to rate Tess any higher than I did, because I just found the film way too miserable. Ironic that I'm talking about Tess alongside Fish Tank, because Roman Polanski is just like Connor for real. Now, all things considered, Fish Tank does actually have its fair share of comedic moments of levity. I think that there's a lot of great dialogue and hilarious bitebacks, and I love the authentically British cusses.
Tell her I think her old man's a cunt!
But I don't think it was enough to truly improve the movie in my mind. Like I said though, this is all personal preference stuff, and I'd also say that it's definitely affected me more over time. To be honest, I actually like this film a lot more on first viewing last September, but that's probably because I was watching it alone and wasn't fully aware of the fact that Connor was a pedo. So therefore, the film didn't feel as uncomfortable overall, until that moment. But then, on my recent viewing for this video, I just didn't enjoy any scene featuring Connor because I knew what he was like, so any moment of mild intimacy made me sound the red alarm. And yeah, watching this movie 3 times in 9 months is seriously not a good idea. This is because it's not just the uncomfortable nature of the film which gets worse over every rewatch, as there's also the low-key social realist nature of the film. Now, I'm personally not the biggest fan of these kinds of kitchen sink dramas. I definitely prefer films with a bit more pizzazz to them in terms of their visual quality and editing, but I can still watch a low-key film no problem. but they're not really something I tend to go back to. Low-key films are meant to be more immersive, but they're also not something that you're really meant to rewatch a million times, because if you do, you're just gonna get bored unless you are really interested in the themes and characters. Sadly, whilst Fish Tank was good, I definitely wasn't obsessed with it by any means, and I wasn't that engaged with the themes and characters, as the themes of poverty aren't that special, and you're not really meant to like the characters. Obviously Connor's a pedo, but alongside him, Joanne's a bitch, and Mia kidnaps a girl at the end of the film. That's fun. Billy's great though, we all like Billy in this house. But as a result of these factors hindering my enjoyment or investment, I found it kinda hard to truly immerse myself in the movie on subsequent rewatches, in contrast to the initial viewing. This meant that, whilst I still appreciate the film, I was admittedly kinda bored at points on my latest viewing. Although to be fair, I always felt like 2 hours was a bit too long of a runtime for what this film actually was. So all in all, Fish Tank is a movie that I can appreciate, and I'll go over the really good stuff of it in a sec, but I do not enjoy it at all, and the 3 viewings of it is more than enough for a lifetime. If I do watch the film again though, it won't be for years in the future, as I think I'd rather just stay far away from this movie. At least I don't have to study it anymore. Also, here's a funny story. I haven't said this in the video just yet, but we weren't actually meant to study Fish Tank initially. We were originally going to be studying Shaun of the Dead. You know, one of my top 10 favourite movies of all time. Yeah, you can imagine how disappointed I was when it was switched. To be fair, one of my friends in a different school said that, because of the questions asked, Shaun wasn't particularly great to study, but I don't really care to be honest, as I would have preferred to study anything. Literally anything else other than Fish Tank. I'd much rather get the chance to watch that Jonathan Glazer movie on the curriculum. Hell, despite it likely also being uncomfortable to watch, I think that I honestly would have preferred to study This Is England. Anyway, in spite of my constant moaning, I do nonetheless want to encourage some of you to check out Fish Tank, because I am certain that many of you won't have the same personal problems that I have, and will therefore really like it as a result. As I alluded to earlier, when this film wants to be funny, it does actually succeed. Whilst Mia may not be the most likeable protagonist in the world, especially by the end, she is nonetheless quite entertaining and funny throughout. I like the part where she pissed in Connor's house. That was well deserved and pretty satisfying. In general, I think that the acting was pretty strong on the whole here. Say what you will about Michael Fassbender as a person, but he did a damn good job playing Connor. He really nailed the creepy side of him, as well as the more manipulative and groomy side. Tyler was also pretty great, despite how young she was. And Joanne... Look, I can't take her seriously because someone in my class called her a MILF, and that image has refused to leave my brain, so I'm forcing you all to think about it as well. Mrs. Williams, you're trying to seduce me. But the thing I really liked about this film was the cinematography. As you can see through the footage I'm showing you, this film is presented in a 4:3 aspect ratio, and it just looks so nice. I don't know what it is, but 4:3 always makes an image look 10 times prettier and crisper. I mean, just look at the Grand Budapest Hotel. Although to be fair, all Wes Anderson films look visually stunning, whereas visuals aren't really a particularly memorable part of social realist films. Yet it is for Fish Tank because the tighter aspect ratio makes everything look surprisingly crisp and striking, and this is present in both lower class London and the countryside. I can't really explain why it looks so nice, it just does. Not to mention, the aspect ratio actually has thematic importance due to being a reflection of the main theme of entrapment that Mia feels. The physical frame is smaller to reflect the claustrophobia of her environment and how she feels trapped by things like poverty. In fact, in general, I feel like the cinematography did a great job of reflecting the themes of the film, such as with the visual motif of the trapped horse that Mia tried to save, and the consistent usage of shots through doorways and windows. It's for these reasons that I totally understand why this film was chosen for this part of the course, as the questions are very much focused on how film form like cinematography was used to reflect themes, and how you can use an ideological critical approach to take meaning from it. But more importantly, the visuals just help this film to stand out on its own. And on a similar topic, the themes in this movie are quite interesting. Yes, they are a bit standard and you can see the same things in many other films, but it's still got its own unique image, and I quite liked how it all built up to the very end of the movie when Mia travels to Cardiff with Billy, as it's kind of ambiguous in how you interpret it. Some may see it as hopeful as Mia is escaping from her home, and some may be more pessimistic and see it as Mia merely transferring her same problems to another location. Either way, it's nice to have that freedom for interpretation. And the final thing to praise this film for is the fact that it's got some good music. Music may not appear very much here, but the licensed tracks used are very nice. I know Connor's a pedo and everything, but he has got some good music taste. Not only does he put on California Dreamin', but he also puts on Get Up Off of That Thing! And baby, you'll feel better! Oh, and on a completely unrelated note, which I couldn't fit in anywhere else, Seeing old school 2009 era YouTube with a radically different layout and the 5-star system brought me so much joy, not gonna lie. In fact, as a whole, I think this film is quite a nice time capsule of the time it came out. Old school YouTube is one thing, but the film also reflects the social and economic problems of the time because it came out in the direct aftermath of the 2008 economic crisis, which caused many people to lose their homes and abandon flats, and that is shown in the film through the place where Mia practices her dancing. I don't know, I just found that all quite interesting. Overall, I think that Fish Tank is a very good movie which a lot of people will get something out of. If you can handle some of the more uncomfortable moments and themes, then I highly recommend checking it out. It's got brilliant cinematography, a lot of great themes and ideas, and it's a nice little time capsule of 2009. Hey, wait a minute, Michael Fassbender was in both this and Inglourious Basterds in 1 year? Huh, talk about variety. However, for me personally, I don't fancy rewatching this film anytime soon, and this was easily my least favourite film to study. Yeah, I actually thought that the two weaker films were more interesting to look into, despite me liking them less. Also, they were a lot less uncomfortable. Oh well. Let's move away from all these films which I just couldn't get into, and instead, let's talk about the films that I actually really liked.
The secret ingredient is crime.
Okay, so it's clear that my opinions on a few of the movies that I talked about so far were made worse for me because of the fact that I studied the films in class. Fish Tank became more uncomfortable and Virus V became more gross. However, to say that studying films always made them worse in my mind is just not true, as there were still a few films which I actually appreciated more after studying them. In some cases, I got more enjoyment out of the film because I was made more aware of some of their stronger attributes. But in the case of Bonnie and Clyde, I ended up appreciating it a hell of a lot more after studying it, because I was taught about some parts of its production and was made aware of how truly influential it is. So, forgive me for banging on about this film's influence before talking about it on its own merits, as the influence does play a significant factor in my overall opinion of the film. As I said in the intro, this film is the token new Hollywood film that we studied, but some of you may be unfamiliar with what that term actually means. Now, there's a million different videos which go into a lot of detail on the new Hollywood era, and there's also a ton of different interpretations on what it truly is, so I can't sufficiently explain it all in this one segment. But, for a quick rundown based on my perspective, New Hollywood is a period of cinema from the late 1960s to the early 1990s, which marked the end of the studio system of Hollywood shown during the classical Hollywood era, in favour of more director-led movies. This period saw the first instance where directors had full creative control over their projects, which thus allowed them to tackle more taboo topics aimed to appeal to a more younger audience. This ultimately led to film becoming a much more experimental art form, as different techniques from the French New Wave were implemented and unique topics with morally grey characters started to become the norm. It also led to a rise in directors who would go on to be identified as auteurs. You know, people like Martin Scorsese or Francis Ford Coppola. The New Hollywood era is one of the most important eras in film history, and most modern movies have this era to thank for their mere existence. Many of the films which are often considered to be some of the best of all time come from this era. You know, films like The Godfather, Taxi Driver, and Apocalypse Now are just a few examples of the famous films from this time. Hell, even blockbusters like Jaws and Star Wars became a thing thanks to the freedom that directors such as Spielberg and Lucas had during this period. Now, the question of when the New Hollywood era started has been long debated, but many people tend to point towards 1967 as the official beginning, due to the release of two significant films which both directly went against the rules of the Hays Code. The Hays Code was essentially a set of rules that films had to follow back in the day, and it banned various topics like homosexuality, for instance, and it also limited the usage of violence and sexual imagery. Now, whilst there were films released before 1967 which found loopholes in the Hays Code, Billy Wilder films come to mind, this was nonetheless the year where the rules really started to be ignored for the first time, which led to the code being retired the following year. The first of the two significant films which brought about this change was The Graduate, directed by Mike Nichols, which was the film I referenced in the Fish Tank segment if you didn't know. This film is all about Dustin Hoffman being sick of his middle class living, which thus leads to him having an affair with an older woman.
Here's to you, Mrs. Robinson, indeed.
And the other 1967 film, which is just as significant, or maybe even more so depending on who you ask, is, of course, Bonnie and Clyde. Now, this film is obviously based on the real story of Bonnie and Clyde, but instead of showing these criminals as antagonistic, horrible figures, the film acts as more of a young lover's story, as we are made to somewhat sympathise with the pair. It's set during the midst of the Great Depression, a time where people were opposed to authority, which means that an audience is likely to sympathise more with Bonnie and Clyde's rebellion as they rob banks and occasionally give money to those screwed over by said banks. They're not good people by any means, but we're made to understand them and you somewhat enjoy watching them do what they do. And this bizarre sympathy felt by the audience is exacerbated by the counterculture present during the time of its release in the 60s. During this time, there was a big disconnect between the younger generation and the authorities due to issues regarding civil rights, the sexual revolution, and, most importantly, the Vietnam War. This led to a lot of people wanting to sort of rebel against the system, and so many new Hollywood films reflect this counterculture. Easy Rider is a common example people point to, but we've also got so many crime films with these morally grey characters, who you kinda sympathise with in a dark way, such as Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, the first literally me character. And of course, there's the movies about Vietnam released a lot later, such as Apocalypse Now and The Deer Hunter. But Bonnie and Clyde was where this trend of counterculture and morally grey protagonists really got started. But that's not all that this film had going for it in terms of breaking the norm, as there's also a greater focus on violence and sex. Well, maybe less so the sex, as Clyde is implied to be impotent, more on that later. But it's still a topic which would have never been discussed beforehand. And as for the violence, look, I know any Tarantino fans may not even bat an eyelid at the violence present in this movie, but, for the time, this film was incredibly shocking to see. Let's put things into perspective, shall we? This is what a guy getting shot in Casablanca looked like. And this is what a guy getting shot in Bonnie and Clyde looks like. You can see the sharp contrast. As a result of everything, Bonnie and Clyde is a film that I have the utmost respect for. Without it, the new Hollywood era would have been radically different, I feel. It definitely would have still happened with films like The Graduate and whatnot, but I feel like it would have taken longer to really find its footing. So yeah, that was a lot of contextual stuff, but I think it's something which is absolutely worth discussing in regards to this film, because it is a major reason for why it's so acclaimed, and, like I said before, learning about all of this made me like the film more. But let's put all that aside, shall we? Is this film any good on its own merits, or is this another Viva Vie situation where it really hasn't held up over the changing times, and now just comes across as different for different's sake? Honestly, I still think that this is a great film. Now, it definitely ain't perfect, and there's a whole lot that I can criticise here, but at the same time, there's a lot that I genuinely do really like, which thus helps to kinda balance out my opinions on the whole. Although I'll start by talking about my issues with the film first, just so I can end on a more positive note. I do definitely think that the pacing was a bit off at points. Some scenes went by way too fast and others seemed to drag out for way too long. It was just a bit inconsistent for me. I also found some of the time jumps a bit confusing, as it was quite hard to get a full picture of how long the gap between some scenes were, which thus left me feeling confused over the full timeline of events. But those 2 points are both admittedly really minor. Now, this next point is probably quite controversial, but I did not like the cinematography here. I don't know, I just didn't find it all that special on the whole, and, in some scenes, I thought it looked kinda shit. I'm specifically referring to the part where Bonnie returns home to her mother. I'm sorry, what is this? This shit doesn't look good at all. It looks like a bad DVD transfer, to be honest. Any excuse you throw, such as, ooh, it looks like an old photograph, won't do anything for me, because I honestly don't care if it represents peace on Earth. I still wouldn't think that it looks very good. Okay, I'll be brutally honest here. I think the only reason for why I'm this harsh on the cinematography in this film is because of spite, as this film beat The Graduate for Best Cinematography at the Oscars. Now, I know the Oscars mean nothing, but The Graduate has some of the best cinematography I've ever seen, whilst Bonnie and Clyde's is just mid by comparison. Honestly, this is the Oscar upset which pisses me off the most. But the absolute worst thing about Bonnie and Clyde is Blanche. Holy shit, she is one of the most annoying characters I've ever seen in a motion picture. I think that the best way to describe her is like a perfect mix between the screams of Willie in Temple of Doom and the uselessness of Barbara in Night of the Living Dead. If that sounds like a horrific combo, you are absolutely correct. Honestly, all of the other criticisms for this movie don't mean anything by comparison. It's mostly just Blanche who lets down this movie in my mind. Now, I understand that Blanche is meant to be an annoying character. For goodness sake, Bonnie hates her. But there's a very fine line to cross when it comes to making a character annoying for the other characters and making a character annoying for the audience. Polito from Puss in Boots: The Last Wish is a great example of this line being crossed well. The other characters are annoyed by his presence, but to any sane audience member, Polito haters are not allowed in this house. This little dog is actually really wholesome and precious, and we love him, and that's because we're looking at him from an outsider perspective, rather than from the character's cynical perspectives. Blanche, meanwhile, is just annoying for everyone. Bonnie hates her, I hate her, my whole class hated her, hell, even my teacher hated her. And as a result of this, it just makes some parts of the movie an absolute chore to sit through. Anyway, that's enough of my criticisms. Let's get back to the good stuff. I think that when looking at this film on its own merits, it is easily at its best when it comes to the relationship between the titular Bonnie and Clyde. These two are honestly just a joy to watch. Yeah, their relationship may not be the deepest thing ever, but it's kinda sweet in a young lover's sense. There's a lot of passion here, and I kinda just liked casually watching them in this film. I don't even care that they're criminals, they're a cool couple at the same time. I also think that their relationship is massively helped by the chemistry between Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway. They were an absolutely fantastic pairing. Yes, Warren Beatty may be so vain that he thinks this song's about him, but he's got this cool guy persona to him which makes him very endearing to watch, and he works really well alongside Bonnie's desires and appetite. Also, I swear his teeth could guide ships away from the rocks. But yeah, these two are great and they make the start of this movie really fun honestly, even when they're doing all these terrible things like robbing, murdering, and reading the wrong Best Picture winner.
La La Land.
I'm sorry, I couldn't not reference the Moonlight La La Land fiasco when it was literally Beatty and Dunaway who presented it in order to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Bonnie and Clyde's release. I know the fiasco wasn't their fault, but I needed to make some kind of jokey reference to it in this segment. I'm only human after all. Going back to their relationship though, I want to talk about something kinda interesting in regards to it, which I picked up on my latest rewatch. I mentioned earlier that Clyde is implied to be impotent, as shown through lines like, "I ain't no lover's boy." Therefore, he obviously can't really have a sexual relationship with Bonnie. Well, as a result of this, I actually started seeing this movie as unintentional asexual representation. I know it's not one-to-one as Clyde physically can't have sex in this case, it's not really a choice for him whilst it is for a lot of aces. But nonetheless, it was kinda nice to see Bonnie and Clyde make their relationship work without sex. I don't know, it just kinda made me feel represented as an ace myself, and trust me, you gotta take what you can get when it comes to asexual representation, and I am more than happy to champion Clyde as the ace icon we didn't know we had. Anywho, Bonnie and Clyde aren't the only characters who I enjoy watching this film, as I also really enjoyed C.W. Mouse as their goofy little sidekick. Plus, this movie also stars my two favourite Genes, Hackman and Wilder, and they are both awesome to see here. Now, I imagine that most of you are probably aware of Gene Hackman being in this movie, seeing as Buck Barrel was one of his first and most well-known film roles. But a lot of you may have been less aware of Gene Wilder's presence, and I don't really blame you as I didn't know about it before watching this film, but it was certainly a pleasant surprise. Remember, this film came out the same year as The Producers, so this is a really early Wilder outing, but he's still just as lovable as ever. Yes, if you couldn't tell, his scene was my favourite part of the movie. As for what else was great here, I feel like there was a lot of external themes related to the glorification of crime, which I found really interesting. Obviously I already went over Bonnie and Clyde's counterculture characters, but there's also a lot related to the media within this movie. The newspapers overplay the Barrow Gang's achievements, they publish Bonnie's poems about the couple, and those involved in the robberies brag about their experiences and take pictures posing with bullet holes and whatnot. It's exciting and interesting for those involved despite it being, you know, a crime scene. I don't know, I just thought that was a really interesting thing to highlight here, and was yet another aspect which helped this film to stand out. And finally, there's some good technical achievements worth highlighting. I think that it's really novel to see a very early blend of French New Wave techniques alongside Hollywood techniques, and said techniques actually worked for me here. Yes, even the Godard-esque jump cuts worked for me, because it was used quite sparingly all things considered, which meant that I could actually follow the film on a base level. Admittedly, this film does feel a bit like a new Hollywood first draft at points, but it's still got its charm. And speaking of charm, I don't care how goofy it is, I love the over-the-top banjo music which is played over every car chase. It was great, honestly. Overall, I call Bonnie and Clyde a great film on the whole. It has its issues for sure, but it makes up for some of its shortcomings thanks to its quality moments, its charm, and its influence. It is absolutely worth a watch if you are interested in film history in any way and you want to see one of the most important films ever made. But even outside of that, you still got an enjoyable as hell crime film here, which I certainly found entertaining. Just maybe mute it whenever Blanche starts screaming.
You shut the fuck up! You shut the fuck up! I hope you die in a fire!
Oh no, I'm not brave enough for politics.
To those of you who have been with my channel for a while now, you probably would have clocked on to the fact that this ranking video is very different to any ranking that I've done in the past, and not just in the subject matter, but also in its presentation. In contrast to the monthly rankings from last year, this video is a hell of a lot more detailed, and this is intentional, as I think that it makes the video a lot more interesting to watch, as it allows me to fully express all of my opinions, which will allow me to fully explain my opinions so that you understand them better. Naturally, this also means that this is the first video where I've gone fully in depth on all of these films, as any previous time I talked about them was relatively short, all things considered. Except there's one exception to this rule, and that's Captain Fantastic. A few years back, I covered this film in depth in a video talking about 5 films I found underrated. Although, in hindsight, I'll be honest, I only really made that video so I could talk about Palak. Either way, I talked about the themes present in this film and just generally spread some appreciation towards it. So you would think that as a result, this will probably be the easiest segment for me to do in this video, as all I have to do is just refer you back to that old video. Right? Well, annoyingly, this is probably the film where opinions have changed the most between first viewing and now, and so I can't really do that. Whilst I still think this film is mostly really great, it does admittedly get slightly worse on each rewatch for me, so that means that I'm going to have to start all over again when it comes to expressing my opinions on it. So, Captain Fantastic is a very interesting film to talk about, I feel, and that's largely because of what it has to say. Admittedly, the film itself is really simple on the whole. I mean, it's literally just a road trip movie across America. Oh Christ, I'm getting Rain Man flashbacks. But it works for me because it's a very thematically rich film which is designed to encourage a lot of discussion from the audience. This is because we follow Ben and his family, who are not the kind of people we would normally align ourselves with. They're basically this alt-left family who live off the grid in the woods. They are very politically charged in their beliefs and are very quick to criticize American society. On the whole, there's a very clear social and political distance between our protagonist and the casual audience. But this allows for interesting discussions to take place when these differences clash with the normal society we are used to seeing in media, and it leads to an interesting conflict. The whole reason for why the road trip is happening in the first place is because Leslie, who's Ben's wife, killed herself, and the family have been forbidden entry to a funeral by her father, Jack. Jack is more in line with a traditional Christian American who you're used to seeing in media, yet in this film, he's initially presented as an antagonistic figure. And to be fair, he's not exactly a perfect guy, as he does do some selfish things like ignoring his daughter's unique will in favour of a traditional Christian burial. I never really liked the fact that he did that, but it's important for his character as it shows he has his flaws. But the interesting thing about Jack is the fact that he's not the antagonist. By the end of the film, he's a lot more sympathetic as he shows himself to have a genuine care for Ben's children. We eventually realise that he was actually understandably upset with Ben, because Ben's lifestyle made Leslie unhappy, and Ben was also harming the well-being of the children through their vigorous exercises. These growing minds shouldn't be toughing it out in the woods with little exposure to the outside world, and that's why Jack made an effort to get custody of the children by the end. By this point in the film, we are actually more so aligned with Jack's actions, and this alignment is made stronger by the fact that Ben is made to be a lot worse by this point in the film. At first we are made to fully align ourselves with Ben because, you know, he's the protagonist. A lot of us may be more willing to actually accept his different way of living, as we're seeing the world through the eyes of Ben, whilst Jack will be seen in a more negative light as he acts somewhat discriminatory towards Ben's choices. Hey man, I've been there. There's at least one thing I do which I can't enjoy without judgment. But as the film progresses, Ben's actions get more and more questionable. He encourages his children to steal food, he acts like a dick in Harper's house, he makes a scene at the funeral, and he also doesn't respect Relian's wishes to leave his family. And that's without looking at the bigger picture that everyone tells him. The way he treats his children is borderline child abuse. They are constantly injuring themselves during their training, he nearly gets one of them killed near the end of the film for goodness sake, and they are all totally unprepared for the real world, as shown through both of his pathetic attempts at romance. I mean, the dude's hot and everything, but I certainly wouldn't marry him after a single day. So yeah, by the end of the film, I kinda wanted Ben to give up the kids for their sake. But at the same time, it was still quite sad to see him have to leave. His methods of raising his kids may have been unorthodox, and it's clear that he was a better teacher than a parent, but he does still care, and because he cares, he decides to leave. Both sides of the conflict in this film are flawed for sure, but they're equally sympathetic in their own way. I think that this is Captain Fantastic's best attribute. It is a very even-handed movie, and, despite of its strong political undertones, is quite level-headed and accessible. In a way. I will admit that if you're also quite politically charged, especially on the right, you probably won't like this movie very much in spite of the even-handed nature of the film, because you will find it near impossible to sympathise with Ben in any way. However, if you're a bit more open-minded in terms of your politics, or you're quite centrist in your beliefs, you'll probably be more likely to get into this. So yeah, I quite like what the movie had to say. It presented ideas you wouldn't normally see and asked a lot of questions which are left for you to figure out an answer to, such as, how much should people accept other people's beliefs? For me, I saw the film as a story of compromise, as Jack and Ben both make an effort to care for the kids in a safer environment. Both sides should have been more accepting of different beliefs to their own, but it's clear that goals such as child safety were not up for discussion. This is why Ben made the compromise and left the kids in Jack's care. All in all, it was a very intelligent and thought-provoking film. I think that a good way to see the effectiveness of this film is to compare it to the other Viggo Mortensen road trip movie, the far inferior Green Book. That's a movie which also has a lot to say, specifically about race, but it doesn't deliver any of its themes in a thought-provoking or unique way. It doesn't challenge its audience at all, and instead delivers the most baseline story about race that you could possibly think of. Whereas Captain Fantastic has a lot more layers to it, and the audience really has to actively participate in the experience and be open to being challenged in order to fully appreciate it. It's for these reasons why I totally understand why we study this film in class, as it works perfectly for the questions all about ideology and spectatorship. All in all, it's a very well done movie. Which kinda lost its way for me in the final 20 minutes, to be honest. Yeah, you know all those comments I made about the film showing compromise as Ben had to leave his kids and everything? Well, I kinda made that fact up. To be fair, there is some semblance of compromise shown near the end, as the kids do still go to school whilst enjoying their own way of living, but it doesn't work nearly as well because this part of the film makes no fucking sense. Like, Ben drives away alongside some kinda schmaltzy music, I'll admit, and then he makes a campfire. And then out of nowhere, all of the kids come out from beneath the floor of the bus to meet Ben again. 3 things. 1, how the hell did the kids get there without Ben seeing? 2, how long were they down there for? It seriously must not have been comfortable, especially for those kids who were injured. And 3, what happened to Jack? How did he not know the kids left, and why does he not appear again for the rest of the movie? Surely he would be trying to get the kids back. Again, right? I know he hasn't yet got legal custody of the kids, but surely he can claim emergency custody, as he's got a basis to do so if he believes that Ben will put them in harm again, or will make them commit another crime. And yes, they do commit another crime. In this case, it's grave robbing. All in all, I really couldn't get behind this ending, as there were way too many plot holes to pick out. It didn't annoy me much on first viewing, but ever since, it has always been really confusing and dumb in my mind. And this ultimately just didn't fit as well into the rest of the film as I hoped it would. Yes, Ben makes compromises and sends the kids to school and whatnot, whilst both of them gets to become fully independent, but I don't know, I just feel like the kids returning back to Ben made the messages feel a bit mixed and not as even-handed as the rest of the movie. It's not awful, but could have been done a lot better. Still, I actually quite liked the funeral scene. It was pretty sweet and was a nice way to end the main story. I didn't even mind the use of Sweet Child of Mine. Was it cheesy? Absolutely, but I couldn't help but like it somewhat. So yeah, a mixed conclusion on the whole, and that's primarily where my change in rating over time has come from. But that doesn't change how much I still enjoyed the rest of the film. It was fascinating to watch, and it was also quite entertaining as well. I don't know about you, but I thought that this film was absolutely hilarious. I just loved watching the sheer absurdity of this alt-left family, as they did things like celebrate Noam Chomsky's birthday. Of all things to celebrate. As for some other things I found funny, I was honestly on the floor during the moment where they pretend to be a religious cult to scare off a policeman. The part where Ben walked out with his cock hanging out Betty Blue style was equally hilarious and really awkward to watch in class. It was still better than every Connor scene, so, you know. And finally, a lot of the stuff with the 2 youngest kids was absolute gold. Side note, but my teacher says that I apparently look a lot like Zarja. Would you agree? I need more input on this. Also, as a completely random point, I like the fact that the bus was called Steve. I don't know, I just thought that was a funny name to call a bus.
Let's call it Steve.
Steve?
It's a pretty name.
And speaking of Steves, Steve Zahn is in this movie, and he's just as epic as you think he is. Okay, sure, his character's no Frank Heffley, but he's definitely the funniest adult character. Although I still like Zarja slightly more because she is apparently literally me for real in terms of appearance. Alright, what else is great? Well, the acting is brilliant across the board. Viggo Mortensen is fantastic as Ben, and I also really liked George McKay as Vodavan. I seriously need to watch 1917, don't I? I loved George McKay both here and in Pride, so he must be amazing in that movie too. I also loved the cinematography in this film. Oh my goodness, this film's gorgeous! I love films like this where a lot of its beauty comes from nature. It just looks so nice and is so comforting at the same time. It certainly makes the Pacific Northwest look stunning, and it really highlights the idea of the paradise of Plato's Republic that Ben aspired for. I think that agreeing with his mindset through the visuals helps with our initial allegiance with him, I think. So overall, Captain Fantastic is a great film. It has its fair share of flaws for sure, but it's got a lot going for it at the same time. It's quite sweet and funny at many points, and its visuals make the film a rather comforting watch, but it truly works for me thanks to its interesting themes, messages, and characters. It is a brilliant choice to study for exams because there is so much that you can analyse with this film. It definitely won't be for everyone. I mean, most of the people in my class kinda hated it, but I certainly enjoyed it.
Okay, I've been boot in a boot.
No, don't do that.
Sweet 16 is very similar to Fish Tank in a lot of ways, which is probably why they were chosen to be studied together as the two British films. But this film was just way better for me for a lot of reasons. I mean, quality-wise, I suppose that they're not too different. Both films still strive to relatively small goals thanks to their low-key nature, and they're not entirely my thing. But Sweet 16 is a movie I can see myself going back to a lot in the future, in comparison to Fish Tank, which I have no desire to rewatch. And the primary reason for why I feel so differently towards Sweet 16 is because of one simple difference between the two films. Sweet 16 may be bleak at many points, but it's counteracted with enough levity that the film doesn't feel as miserable on the whole in comparison to the pedo movie. Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by how much I actually enjoyed this film. As I said, this can be a bit bleak at points, and I'll discuss that in a bit when I talk about the themes, but there was equally a lot of humour present within this film, which I massively appreciated. I'll admit that I haven't seen any other Ken Loach film, but apparently this inclusion of humour is quite common for him, so I'll probably get on with a lot of his other work. Anyway, that's enough of comparing this film to Fish Tank. Let's talk about it on its own merits. So, Sweet 16 follows Liam, who's a young Scottish lad living in poverty who gets caught up with drugs. Trust me, it's a lot more different to Trainspotting than it might initially sound. I will fully admit that on my first viewing, I think I was too harsh on this movie because I was constantly trying to compare it to Trainspotting. Can you really blame me though? We were originally going to be studying it before it got replaced by this film at the 11th hour, so comparisons are practically inevitable. However, in reality, the two films are very different in both story and execution, so it's really not fair to compare them. As I made it clear before, this is a social realist film, so it's definitely not like the stylized Trainspotting, but even the main plot points are different. All things considered, Sweet 16 is barely about the drugs. Liam never does drugs, and the dealing is simply just a reflection of the more prominent theme in the film, that being of poverty. Within this film, Liam's basically trying to get money together to buy a place for him and his mam, Jean, for when she eventually gets out of prison. However, Liam's only able to get money through criminal activity such as drug dealing, and this is where the tragedy of the film comes into play. You see, Liam's actually quite an intelligent young lad. He knows business well and he has the makings of a young entrepreneur. This is shown quite explicitly within the film when Liam successfully manages a drug trade operation through a pizza delivery service. Yeah, sure, it starts off pretty rough, but things do get better, and he's able to pull in more and more money over time. His skills within business are what ultimately allow him to get into the good graces of Tony, who's essentially like the Gus Fring of this movie as he's in charge of the drug trade. However, at the same time, Liam's skills are being wasted on criminal activity rather than something useful in this world, because he's unable to get a foothold into any decent business due to his current social status. While Chantel, who's Liam's sister by the way, is able to get some training at a call centre, she's not really able to call herself well off either, as she has to work her way up from virtually nothing. Liam's initially in the same position as his sister, but he does eventually end up becoming more and more successful over time. Thanks to the drug trade, he's actually able to get himself a nice little middle class flat by the end of the film. But that doesn't change the fact that the methods of getting it was still quite dodgy, and this ends up leading to problems for Liam as Tony forces him to partake in even more serious crimes, and even gives him a knife to kill a supposed rival. Now yes, this does turn out to be just a test, but Liam was still willing to go through with it, which shows how much he's willing to adopt a criminal lifestyle in order to achieve his, all things considered, noble goal of getting a place to stay with his mam. In fact, as a whole, I think the film works as well as it does because Liam is a fantastic protagonist, one of the best from this entire list even. He goes through a truly compelling and tragic arc where he technically gets worse over time, but still has a degree of sympathy towards him as his life and connections fall apart around him. He He starts out the movie very light-hearted and jovial, and he's got a load of great friends with him, including the GOAT that is Pinball. He's a very admirable figure at this point, in spite of his criminal activity, as he very clearly cares for his mum over anything else, to the point that he's willing to get beaten up by Stan if it meant that he wouldn't give drugs to his mum, which would extend her sentence. And throughout the film, he works towards getting a caravan to stay in, which forces him to be more responsible. Whilst he does get into fights and everything, he is nonetheless able to maintain strong relations with Pinball and Chantel as he works towards his noble goal. This all means that by the time Liam gets the caravan, we feel satisfied and happy for him. Sadly, this is where things start to go wrong. Due to Liam's deals with Tony, he begins to drive Pinball away, as Tony doesn't exactly like Pinball's goofy attitude. Liam begins to prioritize his goals over his friendship, which eventually leads to Pinball acting out and destroying the caravan alongside their friendship. And what's worse than the broken friendship with Pinball is the fact that Jean didn't truly deserve all the attention that Liam was giving to her. She wasn't actually a particularly good mother, and Chantel tried to bring this up to Liam many times, but he was too blinded by his natural love for his mum. This leads to Liam becoming desperate for her to stay with him, to the point that he destroys his relation with Chantel by attacking her in a really horrible scene, but horrible in a compelling way. And then he finds Jean with Stan, and then stabs Stan. Now, I'm not saying that Stan didn't deserve it, as he is a prick, but really, Liam should have just left Jean with him. It's very clear that Jean has some kind of Stockholm Syndrome, which is why she went back to Stan, and Liam can't really do anything about that. I understand his duty to help Jean out of this abuse, but anything that Liam would do would always lead to bigger problems for him, as evident by what did actually happen. But he's so desperate. We've seen him break the law many times to reach this one goal, and by the end of the film, he ended up ruining his life thanks to the very knife that Tony gave him. And that ending on the beach, man, that was depressing. For me, I think that Sweet 16 works so well because we're following a really compelling character who changes over time as things become worse for him. But I'd also argue that it was so effective for me because the film wasn't depressing all the time. Yes, the ending is bleak, but, as I mentioned before, there's plenty of levity within the film to contrast this. For me, I feel like the emotional and dark moments work better when you've got plenty of lighter moments to compare it to. It becomes a lot more effective in contrast to something like Fish Tank, which is just generally more miserable to the point that everything kinda blends together for me. It overall makes Sweet 16 more entertaining and powerful at the same time, which thus makes the overall package a lot stronger for me. Now, to be fair, I'm not saying that this film is hysterical or anything, but it did get some good laughs out of me. I think that this film primarily excels with character banter, with Pinball and Liam especially being a great pairing. I also just loved all of the swear-filled rants that the characters go on. I don't know, I just think that the Scottish are funny because of how much they swear all the time and how natural the cusses always sound. Deadpan swears, that's what it is. Speaking of the Scottish though, I should probably bring up the fact that this is quite possibly the most aggressively Scottish movie I have ever seen in my life. If there are any Americans watching, you may have struggled to understand something like Trainspotting because of the accents. Hell, I only just squeaked by with that film. I may be half Scottish, but I'm still a wee English fella at the end of the day. Yet somehow, the accents in Sweet 16 are like 10 times stronger.
Me and Pinball were at country day, man. What a day we had. See this wee place we found.
Fucking get in there! Over the fence there! Are you bastard, you!
Was that English?
Okay. I jest, but I actually really like the inclusion of these thick Glaswegian accents. It gives the film a greater level of authenticity, which not many other films actually have. It makes the audience truly feel like they are in the area, as everyone is speaking like how they should be speaking. The film doesn't care about being accessible or anything, it wants to be authentic, which works because it makes the social themes more effective, as you can have an easier time applying it to the real world areas near Glasgow, where this film takes place. In saying that though, you do need to put on subtitles if you don't live in Scotland, otherwise you will be completely lost. Trust me. Like I said, it's not a dig at the film as I do still like it, but it's nonetheless worth acknowledging. Still, if you're capable enough to treat it like a borderline foreign language film, you'll get a lot out of it. To be honest, in spite of the accents, I feel like this film is a hell of a lot more accessible than Captain Fantastic, hence why I placed it above. Its themes and characters can resonate with a lot more people, and I can't really picture many people hating it. It's not as dominated by contrasting political opinions, you know, even if Loach's socialist beliefs do naturally bleed into it slightly. Also, I like this film more than Captain Fantastic because I just thought that was a lot tighter, especially around its climax. In fact, that's a good word to describe this whole film. It's tight. Its characters are strong, its pacing doesn't drag due to its short 100-minute runtime, there's a greater balance of serious drama and good humour, and it's just got a lot to digest and think about. I admit that I wasn't big on this film first time around, probably because I was spiteful that I replaced Trainspotting, but I've since grown to appreciate it a lot more. Yes, Trainspotting is more interesting and probably would have been better to study, but I'm still glad that we got an opportunity to watch a more lesser known yet great film. Also, I don't think I can face watching that toilet scene in class. Jeez.
I loved more girls than I ate pies, but I couldn't stand my wife.
He couldn't stand his wife.
Am I going crazy, or does this dude at the dinner table in Sunrise look exactly like David Lynch? Is he a time traveller or something? I think there's a deeper conspiracy going on here, not gonna lie. Anyway, I am most definitely the only person in my class who would rank Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans this highly on their personal ranking. Because, trust me, I was definitely this film's biggest offender. Everyone else did not like it very much. Now, for me, whilst I did love this film for a lot of different reasons, I can equally understand why this was so unpopular, because there's a lot working against this film for much of the audience, especially a more modern audience. I think the immediate thing to talk about in regards to this film is the fact that it's a silent film. This reason alone is why some people in the class may not be able to get into it. Look, I get it. Silent cinema is not for everyone, and I think more cinephiles need to just accept that fact. Silent movies are just radically different to regular movies. They are a lot slower paced, and they require an audience to make themselves more immersed in with the visuals, as there's no dialogue to go off of. An audience really needs to pay attention to the acting in the face in order to be emotionally invested, as there's no voice to go off of. That's hard to do, and a lot of people can't get into it as a result. Many people will find silent movies alienating, and combining that with a slower pace will make them feel bored, and that's perfectly understandable. A friend once said to me that silent cinema can only be enjoyed by the most patient of film fans. And yeah, that's the best way to describe it. If you don't like silent cinema, that's fine. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It's clear that in my class, most of the people there couldn't get on board with the silent nature of the film. Me, however, I can definitely get into them a little bit more. Although I am definitely more of a silent comedy fan rather than a silent drama fan. I love anything with Buster Keaton in because he is the GOAT. And Charlie Chaplin is obviously legendary as well. But I kinda liked those stars because the light-hearted comedic nature of the stories they told meant that it was easier to follow without dialogue. You don't need sound to appreciate the stunts of Buster Keaton or the simple emotions of Charlie Chaplin. However, for me at least, a lot of the silent dramas felt kind of hindered by the fact that they were silent. I really liked The Passion of Joan of Arc, which I previously mentioned within this video, but I equally found it less immersive than some other films, because it had to use intertitles for its dialogue instead of having it flow naturally. It is generally speaking a very dialogue heavy film without dialogue, which thus means that in its execution, something felt a little bit off for me. Like I said, I still liked it, but I didn't love it. And then there's Metropolis, where the slow pace of silent films, on top of the 2.5 hour long runtime, made the film a bit of a slog for me. At least it's technically very well done. However, despite also being a silent drama, I actually got on a lot better with Sunrise, and I think that's simply because its story was quite simple, endearing and universal, and was able to work without dialogue. In contrast to Joan of Arc, where there are so many intertitles, I swear there was only like 10 in this film, and most of them are just in that one church scene. Therefore, it's clear that this film made more of an effort to work with the fact that it's silent, so it felt less restricted by it in my opinion. So yeah, I was able to enjoy the story in Sunrise more than other silent dramas because of how it was presented. Although, the story does lead me on to the other reason for why this was unpopular. So basically, the plot follows the man, yes, that's literally his credited name. Oh my god, is he Man from Bambi? Anyway, the man is unhappy with his marriage, so he has an affair with a woman from the city. And this woman deadass tells him to drown his wife so that he can go to the city with her. And he actually nearly goes through with it. I mean, he doesn't kill his wife, thank God, but he does still spend the rest of the movie begging for forgiveness, and doesn't fully redeem himself, all things considered. I mean, how can you redeem yourself from attempted murder of a spouse? A lot of people took issue with this, and yeah, I can see why. This is a clear example of domestic abuse, and the wife was definitely quite quick to forgive the man who, let's be honest, didn't really deserve forgiveness. So yeah, it's clear this movie is a product of its time. Yet, for me, I somehow didn't take as much issue with it as I thought I would, and there's two main reasons for why. First of all, I can usually still enjoy things in spite of their dated elements, so long as they don't cause greater issues in the real world, like Rain Man, or their dated elements are a key part of the film's identity, like Viva Savi, I can usually just accept older films as a product of their time. But the bigger reason for why I didn't feel as uncomfortable whilst watching this film is because I don't think that this film is meant to be taken too seriously. This is because this is a very expressive movie, rather than being a realist drama, and I know this because that's what the exam question was all about here. This film utilises a ton of techniques from German expressionist films, such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, the latter of which is especially relevant because F.W. Murnau directed both that film and Sunrise. These techniques can be seen through things such as the off-kilter sets, which can be shown in scenes like the David Lynch one, or the costumes which reflect both the good and bad women. And that's without talking about Kammerspiel film techniques, which are a kind of psychological realism which gives seemingly normal scenes a bit of extra flair. Just watch the marsh scene and you'll see how exaggerated and expressive this film can get. As a result of these techniques, it makes it clear to me that the more problematic elements of the film aren't meant to be looked at in a literal way. They are instead an exaggerated portrayal of how bad a marriage can become, and it goes so big and crazy with its story in order to make the message of the film about love more universal. At least that's how I saw it, and if you can't look at it the same way, I totally understand. For me though, I was able to find the film strangely endearing and really enjoyable. Although, in saying that, the film does start off in quite a depressing way. I don't know, I found it quite upsetting to see just how bad this marriage between the man and his wife had become. I mean, it doesn't quite top that roleplay scene from Inside Number 9 in terms of depressing broken marriages, but it's still up there. Now, these opening scenes are definitely the most slow and atmospheric scenes in the film, but I think they ultimately work for me because the misery of the farm at this moment is truly felt in my eyes. But it equally helps with the tension of various scenes, as it feels quite ominous at many points, which all eventually build to the scene on the boat. No wonder why they got a vampire director to make it, because Murnau just knows how to build tension, even in a less fantastical film like this. But these scenes do still have some bright spots to them, especially whenever the city becomes alluring to the characters, and the woman from said city does a little boogie. This eventually leads to the latter part of the film. After the ominous opening and the more emotional middle, the couple are able to reconcile in the church in what I honestly thought was quite a touching scene. And then they spend the next, 30 minutes or so just vibing and having fun in the city, and oh my goodness, it is so much fun. Once you put aside the man's dodgy actions, you are left with an absolute riot of a film with so many sweet and funny moments with the couple just enjoying themselves. They walk out in the middle of a road and disrupt traffic in a really funny way, but it's sweet to see their romance blossoming again in spite of everything that happened. They then go to the barbers and scare a perv, and then they go get a picture done, and let's just say that the photographer is a legend, and then they go to this amusement park and a pig escapes and the man has to chase it and the pig gets drunk, and it's all just amazing. I especially like the scene where the couple dance at the amusement park. Not only was it really cute, but I related to this guy right here. The woman's dress straps keep falling down, and this guy gets so annoyed that he tries to keep them up, but they always end up falling back down. Yeah, that would annoy me too, to be honest. Eventually he gets so sick of doing it that he actually pulls both of the straps down. Hey, at least they're consistent now. He probably shouldn't have done it, but I can't say that I wouldn't have considered doing it myself, because that's just the easiest solution. Fix your dress, lady. So yeah, this whole portion of the movie is just so much fun in every caliber, and is the primary thing I look forward to every time I rewatch this film. But the film does still end in a pretty tense way, as a storm nearly kills the wife, but she's ultimately okay thanks to Chekhov's reeds. It's all great. So yeah, I actually enjoyed the story of this film, all about a romance falling apart and blossoming again. It's very nice in an absurdist way in the context of this film, and I enjoyed so many different scenes. I'm still not over that pig though. That is the most legendary pig I've ever seen in my life. But do you want to know the biggest reason for why I love this movie? I love it because it is a technical masterpiece. There's literally no other word to describe it. I mean, just look at these sets. Holy mackerel! They are amazing even by modern standards, let alone 1920s standards. They are some of the biggest sets ever created for a film, and man, do they pay off in the long term, because wow, the amusement park set especially is just so gorgeous. But I also love the simpler farm sets, and yes, these farm sets were created from scratch. Even the tram was part of the set. It's all just so impressive how they were able to pull this off, and I think that Sunrise is definitely the best example of what a high budget film should look like. All things considered, this film technically had an unlimited budget. All William Fox wanted Murnau to do was to make him a masterpiece, and he didn't care how much it was going to cost. So, Murnau did just that by blowing all of Fox's budget on these massive sets. I mean, I shouldn't have to tell you that this film ended up flopping and putting Fox in the red, but I think it was worth it in the long run. If you're wondering, this film cost around $200,000 in 1927, which, adjusting for inflation, translates to around $3 million in today's money. Now, I know that doesn't sound high by modern standards. I mean, Bottle Rocket had a higher budget for goodness sake. But for the time, it was kind of unheard of. But man, it was worth it. You could truly see where the money went. Hey Disney, if you're willing to spend an absurd amount of money on your movies, can you at least make them look like Sunrise rather than Quantumania? Anyway, it's not just the sets which are bloody amazing here, but also the editing. I mean, just look at the way that they use superimposition in really creative ways. Like, you don't even see these kinds of techniques in modern films, but it works so well and looks really cool here. At least there's some fantastic and memorable sequences, like the one on the road. Considering the fact that movies were edited on physical film back in the day, I have no idea how they were able to pull off these effects. Like, seriously, what did they do to achieve it? Did they, like, stack the film strips on top of each other? I really don't know, honestly. And let's not forget about the intertitles, which were also really creative and expressive at points. I like the way that some of them withheld the full message by hiding certain words in order to create a bigger impact on the audience, and the look of the drowning message especially looks really cool. This film just doesn't let up when it comes to its creativity and the visuals. And finally, this is going to be kind of weird to say, but I like the way that sound was used. Now, I know that this is a silent film, except it's actually not. Yes, there's no dialogue, but there is actually audio. You see, this film came out in 1927. What else came out that year? The Jazz Singer, the first movie to feature spoken dialogue. So by this point, those crazy people at Hollywood were able to figure out how to do sound, and so, synchronized soundtracks for a lot of the remaining silent films being produced started to be used. This meant that a live orchestra was no longer needed, as prints of the films had pre-recorded music. But more importantly, it allowed films like Sunrise to actually use a few sound effects, such as for a train, the cars, additional music from jazz performers, and even had a sound which they gave to the man when he was calling out for his wife. I just thought that the way that the limited sound was used was really creative for the time, and was, once again, a really cool and expressive thing that this film did. So overall, I personally loved Sunrise. I get why it wasn't everyone's cup of tea, but I honestly found it quite endearing, very entertaining, and absolutely masterful when it comes to its editing, direction, set design, and even its sound design. What more can I say? I just really liked it. Fascist! I was very disappointed in Pan's Labyrinth, let me tell you. I spent the whole movie waiting for David Bowie to rock up, and he never did. Like, what was up with that? I was promised David Bowie. At least I was until I realised I was thinking of the wrong Labyrinth movie. All joking apart though, Pan's Labyrinth is absolutely fantastic. It is such a unique film in the way it portrays its story and anti-fascist themes, and I feel like there's a lot that you can say about very little here. All things considered though, I was actually kind of surprised by how relatively simple this film's ideas truly were when you think about it. As I was writing notes for this film, I didn't really feel stretched to create meaning out of everything, and could instead interpret things on a relatively simple level. I mean, what do its themes really boil down to? Fascism is bad. That's kinda it. But I nonetheless think that this film actually works in spite of its simplicity for two main reasons. One, well, it's a valid theme to have, and I don't think you need to go that much deeper with it. And two, the theme is portrayed in a really interesting way due to the fact that it is blended with a childlike fairy tale, which means that we're sort of seeing this film from a child's perspective, where things are obviously categorized into a simple good and bad. As a result, the fascists in this film are seen as the unequivocal bad guys, because that's how a child would perceive them. You don't really need to look deeper into the minds of the fascists, because their evil actions are more important to the story. In a similar vein to Sunrise, the heightened exaggeration of the way that something is portrayed is a means to reinforce the underlying message in a stronger and more universal way, and I find that to be something quite interesting about this film, and is one major reason for why this works as an anti-fascist story. In fact, the links between the fantasy stuff and the fascist stuff continue to be an interesting part of this movie, and they really help it to stand out from any other similar story because of the unique interpretations that you can take away from it. It's clear whilst watching this film that the main fairy tale story is more likely than not to be imaginary. It's essentially Ophelia's safe space that she can go to whilst dealing with her real world issues, such as her sick mother and fascist stepfather who she hates. Now, you would think that a child's fantasy world would be light-hearted and wholesome, but instead, it's dark and scary and mysterious here, because fascism is starting to creep into the stories that Ophelia tells to herself, which thus reflects her loss of childhood innocence. No child should imagine a situation as horrific as the Pale Man scene, but Ophelia does because she sees the fascist Captain Vidal as this monster, with the parallels being shown through the fact that they both sit at the end of a table. Oh, and there's also a pile of shoes. This is a film about fascism set in 1944. I'll give you 3 guesses what this represents. So yeah, it's clear that the fantasy sequences, such as the Pale Man scene, directly tie into fascism. Not only is this a unique way to reflect the main theme of the film, but it does add a lot to Ophelia's character as it shows her imagination and loss of innocence over time, which thus makes her a bit more than your stock child protagonist. But the main thing I like about the fantasy scenes are its ambiguous moments, particularly at the end with the simple question of, was it actually real or not? Now, I know I said earlier that it's implied to be imaginary, and this is supported by the fact that Vidal can't see the fawn at the end, but there's equally enough evidence to argue that the fantasy stuff was actually real, as Ophelia did use the chalk to escape, and Vidal was drugged by Ophelia, so it's likely that we can't trust his perception of reality. The film never gives a clear answer for either argument, and that's honestly really great, as it makes the film more interesting to talk about as a result. Plus, it reflects Del Toro's belief that absolute certainty equals authoritarianism, which means that it's better for us to create our own interpretations that we personally believe in. Speaking of ambiguity, I also like some of the unsolved mysteries in the film, such as, why did Ophelia eat the food? I like it because we can create our own theories out of it. I personally subscribe to the theory that the fawn secretly made her eat it as part of the test, with the evidence being that the sound in the scene is kinda hypnotic in a way. It's kinda hard to explain, but listen out next time you watch this scene. Anyway, all of those points are related to the fantasy sequences, but that's not the main part of the film. Most of the film actually takes place in reality in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War, with Captain Vidal hunting down the rebel groups, and these scenes are brutal in their depictions of the evils of fascism. They just do not let up, and they get so violent and gory at points that I'm convinced that Tarantino took over for a second. It's very effective. However, this kinda leads me on to a point which I've been feeling more and more in recent times. I think that Vidal was a little bit too brutal of a villain. Now yes, we're not meant to sympathise with Vidal at all. He is an irredeemable monster who murders people left, right and centre. But that's all he really is, to be honest, and I honestly think that makes him less compelling and effective. For me, the most terrifying villains are the ones who feel the most human, but Vidal is so evil and angry all the time that he feels less human and more like one of the fairy tale monsters. Now this was probably an intentional decision on Del Toro's part, but I personally think that a more compelling Vidal would have been that bit better. Just have him smile once. Have a scene where he does something kinda normal. Use the dinner scene as a way to have him sort of fake an affection for his wife in order to trick everyone else at the dinner into thinking that he's a normal person. I would have much rather seen the film kind of manipulate the audience into seeing him in a slightly different way, even if it's just for one scene, as that will make him feel more human, which thus makes his evil actions more shocking. I mentioned this in my Letterboxd review for Django Unchained, but I think villains are scarier when they smile more than they frown, because you don't know when the aggression is going to strike. Now obviously I was talking about Candy in that context, but instead I'm going to use a different Tarantino villain as a point of comparison to Vidal. I'm specifically going to use Hans Landa from Inglourious Basterds, because, you know, fascism and everything. Honestly, to me at least, Landa is just the better version of Vidal because he's got this weird charm to him. He tricks you into thinking you're safe with him until that moment where his more quiet aggression comes out. But this wider range of emotion is what makes him more compelling and more terrifying for me. Vidal, meanwhile, is just angry and violent all the time, even when he's just shaving. This means that anything horrific that he does just finds itself blending together for me instead of sticking out. I essentially become numb to his evil because it's all I see from him. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that I found some of the real world scenes a bit repetitive in their violence, and that could have been resolved if we just saw more emotions to Vidal. Keep him evil, absolutely, but also make him a bit more interesting at the same time. But that's really the only major thing I'd change about this film, and it's not really a big deal to be fair. It's clear what this film wanted to go for, and this change is definitely more of a personal thing I feel. Anyway, in spite of a slightly bland Vidal, there's still plenty of great characters to balance him out. I especially loved the kind, caring Mercedes and the epic as shit Doctor. I don't know why everyone in my class thought that he was so epic, other than the fact that he's a nice guy, but we all loved every scene he was in and was devastated when he died. Also, his name's Dr. Ferrero. I've never been able to take his name seriously because my teacher nicknamed him Dr. Ferrero Rocher. That's now his new permanent name, and you can't tell me otherwise. Now that I've covered the themes and characters of this film, I think that now is the perfect time to talk about the visuals, which is especially important to do in this context because the questions on global cinema in the exam were all about aesthetics and film form, so I can't not bring up the visuals in relation to this film. But yeah, this is a very technically impressive and gorgeous looking movie, and I think that this is primarily thanks to Guillermo del Toro, who is, in my opinion, one of the most talented contemporary directors we have. My goodness, this man has such a keen eye for filmmaking, and he makes every shot look like a beautiful work of art. He's able to create so many fantastical worlds and scenarios with so much unique whimsy to them, in spite of their darker undertones. He's an absolute master of his craft, and Pan's Labyrinth is his most famous film for a reason. Although I still prefer The Shape of Water personally. Still, Del Toro directs the hell out of this movie. It is just such a visual treat which successfully captures the horrors of fascism alongside childlike wonder. I just love the colours, the framing of the shots, and the scene transitions. Oh my god, those scene transitions between the fantasy world and real world are so good! Oh man, those moments gave me way too much pleasure, to be honest. Oh, and all this praise of the visuals is without mentioning all of the phenomenal practical effects used for the creature designs, such as with the Fawn and the Pale Man. These creatures still look incredible, even today, with the Pale Man especially being absolutely fucking terrifying. Side note, but seeing everyone's blind reaction to this scene in class was hysterical. None of them were prepared for this scene, let me tell ya. However, yeah, I hate to be a negative Nancy, but not all of the effects look good. The practical stuff is amazing, no doubt, but the 2006 CGI is definitely showing its age. I mean, it's not awful and doesn't take me out of the film too much, but it is a bit jarring to go from the phenomenal looking Fawn to the CG Toad, which looks kinda rough, not gonna lie. Still, Del Toro is such a good director that he's able to show these things off in such a way that only the most observant people will notice the issues with it. On the whole though, this film is absolutely beautiful, and I don't just mean that in terms of its visual qualities, as the music is also incredible, and everything put together helps to bring some light to the horror shown. This film doesn't sugarcoat anything, and it even ends with Ophelia dying, but it's got this strange beauty to it which makes the film stick out more in your mind as we truly get to see this childhood innocence destroyed. Because of the way that this film was presented, I damn nearly cried at the ending on my latest rewatch. I'm not even joking, it's just such a tragic scene, but it's also so well done. Overall, I absolutely loved Pan's Labyrinth. Whilst I personally would have liked to have seen a more interesting Vidal to make some of the real world scenes more varied, the rest of the film is firing on all cylinders, so I can't get too mad. Its themes are really strong, its violence is brutal but warranted, the beauty of the film helps with the emotion, and the story is just so unique. Considering the fact that my favourite film of all time is a fairy tale, it's not much of a surprise that I also loved this fairy tale as well.
Let's put a smile on that face.
Have you guys ever heard of this niche little indie director called Christopher Nolan? He made some films which you probably haven't heard of before. You know, things like Following and Insomnia, starring Al Pacino. You know, both good movies, but you probably haven't seen them, let's be honest. Although I think he was also responsible for that Barbie movie from last year, but I may be getting it mixed up with some other summer 2023 movie. Barbenheimer jokes are still funny, right? Okay, all joking apart, I really love Christopher Nolan as a director. I know it's a bit of a film bro-y opinion to say that I love Nolan, but there's a reason for why he's popular. His stories are truly mind-bending, but equally so unique and oftentimes very rewatchable. His direction is stellar and he brings such a large scope to everything in order to make his films truly stand out visually. And he's got the perfect blend of a cool as hell style with plenty of engaging substance. He's responsible for some of the most acclaimed films ever made, such as The Dark Knight, Memento, and a personal favourite of mine, Interstellar. But I'm not going to be talking about any of those movies today. Instead, I'm going to talk about the film which arguably encapsulates all of Nolan's best attributes the best, and was certainly the film which made him the truly legendary director that he is now. And that film is Inception. I mean, it's just got everything that you could want from Nolan. It's weird and confusing, but it's always continuously engaging. It looks stunning and has so many cool and unique ideas and set pieces, but it's also not devoid of humanity, and it's overall a very rewatchable movie which you can continuously get a lot out of, and there's just so much to talk about here. But, to be honest, I don't really know what to say about Inception, as this is arguably the most well-known film from this entire list, so chances are that you've probably seen it, or you've heard other people sing its praises. There's not really much that I can add to the conversation, and I equally don't have the time or knowledge to go into the deeper complexities of the subconscious shown within this film. In spite of that though, I'm going to try my best to talk about why I love this film so much. As I alluded to before, I love the fact that this film blends a high-concept sci-fi crime thriller with a genuinely compelling story and a strong main character arc, as it helps this film to stand out from any other film, whilst also being fascinating to watch in the moment for a multitude of reasons. The whole idea of the film, of these thieves invading the subconscious to extract secrets and stuff, is such an off-the-wall, unique and crazy idea, and I know that I would have never been able to come up with something like it, but it's honestly ingenious and allows the film to explore these psychological themes in such a compelling way, which also allows for a one-of-a-kind heist story to be told as well. But the main reason for why it works is because of its execution. Yes, this film is very confusing on first viewing, as you're kind of just chucked into this crazy world with Ariadne being the only character in the same boat as you. But, despite starting out as kinda confusing, it never feels stupid or illogical, and you really want to figure everything out. You actually care about what is being shown to you, which thus encourages you to figure out how this world works, which makes subsequent viewings more rewarding, as you now know what's going on and you feel better when you can begin to align yourself more with the extractors, rather than just Ariadne. You can now spend your time enjoying the execution of these wacky ideas, rather than simply trying to figure them out. But even on first viewing, the film doesn't feel alienating in spite of its confusing nature. As I said, it feels like it's inviting you to look deeper into it, instead of scaring you away from its weirdness, which means that, on first viewing, you're able to appreciate the film because you're not familiar with its ideas yet. You're instead experiencing it all with fresh eyes, where you can become fascinated by every new thing shown. Your curiosity trumps your confusion at many points, and you only really desire the answers by the film's end. The response to the film on the initial viewing is made possible thanks to factors such as the stunning visuals. If the main ideas of this film were uninteresting as well as confusing, no audience would care to learn about what's happening. However, because the ideas in Inception are so unique, you want to know more, and the visuals are used to really reflect the full extent of this film's uniqueness, whilst bringing such a large scope to everything. The subconscious is presented in a visually stunning way, with gorgeous cinematography and some of the best effects from any film. Sequences such as the rotating corridor fight scene are ingrained into your mind, because it's a scene unlike anything you would have seen from any other film. You're essentially passively immersed into the action and visuals, to the point that you don't care that you don't understand what you're being shown. Instead, you're hooked on it all, and the deeper ideas also present will keep you hooked long into the future, even when the spark of these visual treats will have worn off. Basically, this film perfectly balances the appeal for both active and passive spectators, which means that most people will get something out of its ideas and the way that they're presented. Okay, admittedly I'm only really highlighting this stuff as that's what the exam question focused on in regards to this film, but, and this is something I need to emphasize, in spite of all of these cool sci-fi ideas, the main reason for why I love this film as much as I do is because of the compelling main plot with Cobb. When I watch a film, I care more about strong character moments over anything else, which means that I wouldn't normally love a film like Inception if it was all style and confusing plot beats alongside blank slate characters. Damn it! Sorry, something in my throat. However, Inception doesn't fall into this trap, because Cobb is a legitimately fantastic protagonist. Instead of being your generic action hero, Cobb is actually a deeply flawed character who's suffering with the grief over what happened to his wife Mal. At the heart of this film is a broken relationship between Cobb and Mal, which was caused as a result of Cobb's actions. Mal killed herself because she believed she was in a dream, and she only had this idea because Cobb planted it within her subconscious when the pair were stuck in limbo, and it persisted even when they got out. Obviously he didn't mean to get her killed, but he nonetheless made a major mistake which he's stuck having to deal with, which thus ends up jeopardizing the heist at many points. He is essentially a broken man who spends the whole movie trying to move past his guilt, and he eventually does this by owning up to his mistakes, and not just his mistakes with Mal. The thing is, Cobb isn't really a good person, and this is something you pick up on more on every subsequent rewatch. At the end of the day, he is still a thief who's invading people's privacy and emotionally manipulating poor Cillian Murphy just to help with Saito's business. Not to mention, he chose not to tell any of his team that Fisher had defences within his subconscious, despite the risk that it caused them, and eventually those risks came true when one of the defences shot Saito. There's a lot of different interpretations that you can take away from this, with my personal favourite being DCS Media's perspective that Cobb has some sort of hero syndrome. But no matter how you interpret Cobb's actions, it was still a shitty thing for him to do. But by the end of the film, he makes a major sacrifice after accepting Mal's death, and selflessly decides to stay down in limbo to rescue Saito, who died within the dream. To me, this is Cobb's redemption after everything he did before. He selflessly made an effort to save another human being, even if it meant that he would lose the chance to achieve his one and only goal, to see his kids again. Of course, everything turns out alright for him, and he does get his reward in the form of his reunion with his kids at the end. Or does he? So yeah, it's about time that I gave my opinion on the ambiguous ending. Did the spinning top fall over, or not? Is Cobb still in a dream? Well, my answer may surprise you. It doesn't matter. Caring so much about this answer is fundamentally missing the point of Cobb's character. In the scene, he spins the top, and then he goes to his kids, and by the end, he's not even looking at his totem anymore, because he doesn't care. He's with his kids now. That's his reward. It doesn't matter how he got there, or whether it's real. He achieved his goal now, and is happy how he is. That's the true meaning of the ending. But yes, I do still think that the totem was about to fall over, I mean just look at it. But this is yet another great example of this film's strengths. The ambiguousness of the ending leaves you with a strong talking point and encourages you to watch the film again, but from a deeper perspective. It's a really effective way to end a film. So yeah, Cobb is an incredibly interesting protagonist, one of Nolan's strongest in my opinion alongside Cooper and Leonard. But he's not the only character here with deeper things to them, as there's also Fisher, who has a surprising amount of depth to him in regards to his relationship with his father. Once you put aside the questionable actions of the extractors, it is honestly heartbreaking to see him have to deal with his grief over the loss of his father, who he believed was disappointed in him. In reality though, Lil Killian Sr. just wanted Fisher to carve his own path forward. That scene in the vault is so good, man, and Cillian Murphy is just such a phenomenal actor. And he's super hot as a bonus. Speaking of hot men, I also enjoyed some of the side casts in this movie, particularly Tom Hardy as Eames. I always love Tom Hardy in anything, and he's amazing once again in this movie, as he is easily the funniest and most standable character. He's a great example of how more dramatic and tense stories like this really benefit from comedic moments or characters. However, my comments about the side cast do actually lead me on to my one criticism with this movie. Whilst Cobb and Fisher are both incredibly well realised characters, a lot of the other side peeps are kinda bland, which left me with less things to latch onto on my third viewing. Now to be fair, many of them didn't need to be that deep. Eames is funny and that's it. Ariadne is the likeable audience surrogate and that's it. And Saito is primarily a character made for the plot first and foremost, but he's an effective presence when it comes to the plot, as him getting shot in Dream Level 1 leaves major ripples as he needs to survive to make a phone call to get Cobb his life back. So yeah, all of those characters are simple, but they get away with it. However, Yusuf is one of the blandest characters ever, because we never get to see him to the point that I always forget about his existence. But the main character who I wanted to see expanded upon was Arthur. He's Cobb's right-hand man and closest partner, yet, by the end of the film, I felt like I didn't really know who he was. Yeah, he's cool to watch in many scenes, particularly the hotel one, and he does have some funny moments with Eames and Ariadne, but I really wanted more from him. Even something as simple as a backstory which explains how he and Cobb met would have added a lot to his character, and would have given the film just a bit more to talk about. And if you're wondering where this backstory would fit in within the structure of the story, how about using it as a replacement for that pointless as hell chase scene which is just kinda sandwiched into the middle of the film for no reason? Seriously, what was the point in that scene? Instead, I would have preferred that this film spent that time as a way to develop one of their most important yet mysterious side characters. To be fair though, I am kinda nitpicking with this point, as there really isn't a whole lot that I can criticise with Inception, as I do think that is phenomenal on the whole, and you all know why. It is so captivating and it's got plenty to immerse yourself with in both its plot and characters. And that's without mentioning its other strong attributes, such as the flawless visuals. Not only do they perfectly blend practical effects with timeless CG, but some of the sets are really cool. I mean, just look at all the Bond homages. The Snow Fortress is literally the Snow Fortress from On Her Majesty's Secret Service. That's really cool, to be honest. On the whole, Inception is just a visual treat, and I would happily call it the best looking film on this entire list. And alongside the visuals, the editing is spellbinding, and, of course, Hans Zimmer's score is absolutely phenomenal. Hans Zimmer is already the GOAT, but he really goes above and beyond here with some of his most iconic and impressive tracks, such as Time, which is the song used at the very end. It's so good, man. Also, here's a funny story. Because he watched around half of this film in class first thing in the morning one day, I found myself stuck hearing Hans Zimmer for the rest of the day as a result. This meant that as I was trying to focus in history, all I could hear in my head was Hey, I wasn't complaining. I just absolutely love this film to bits, and it was my favourite from this list for a long time. Obviously it went down a little bit, mostly because of my issues with the side characters, which crops up more and more in subsequent viewings, but that doesn't change the fact that this is truly a modern classic and was a perfect contrast to Captain Fantastic. One's an immersive sci-fi epic which encourages but doesn't require discussion, and the other is a low-key indie film which requires an open mind to appreciate properly. Both films are definitely bangers, but Inception is certainly the more ambitious film, and it pulls off its ambitions flawlessly, and I just adored it. Yet somehow, there are two more films that I found myself enjoying just that little bit more.
Here's looking at you, kid.
Oh, Rick.
Bye! Casablanca is a stone cold classic in every sense of the word, and was quite possibly the most perfect choice for a classical Hollywood film to study, as it's a quintessential cornerstone of American cinema, which you just can't not love. It's pretty much perfect in every way, and it's been referenced so many times over the years to the point that all of you are most definitely aware of this film at the bare minimum. Even if you don't even know that you know it, you'd be surprised how many famous lines come from this film.
Round up the usual suspects.
There is so much that I can say about this movie, from the context of its release to the fantastic arcs of the characters. On the topic of characters, Sam is the most epic character in film history, and one of my friends used an image of him as their iPad lock screen all year because we all loved him. And alongside that, there's a top tier wit and humour sprinkled throughout, and of course, the pitch perfect ending which just tops it all off in a beautiful way. However, after thinking about things for a little while, I've actually made the decision to not talk about all these great aspects of the film in this video. The thing is, I've got something else planned for Casablanca in the future of this channel. I won't say what it is just in case plans don't follow through, but I can safely say that I will be returning to this film in the future to give it the respect that it deserves in some capacity. For now though, I'd recommend just watching it for yourself in order to fully appreciate this masterpiece. However, I don't want to leave this segment as a worthless footnote within this video whilst I wait to talk about it further. So instead, I want to offload some of the things that I learnt about this film in class because, to be honest, this was probably my favourite film to study, which is quite funny to say as this was actually the very first film we studied. I don't know, I just preferred learning about the history and production details of the films rather than the ideological critical approach stuff, which also means that I love studying Bonnie and Clyde and Sunrise as well. However, something about Casablanca just hit differently for me, because I just loved learning about how different classical film productions were in comparison to what it's like nowadays. Obviously there was the studio system, which was ever present in this era, and played a vital part in how older films were made. It was really interesting to learn about this system more, and to see how different studios all had their own unique quirks associated with them. This is reflected in Casablanca through the noir style of the film, which was commonplace for many Warner Brothers films, like The Maltese Falcon for instance, due to the fact that the studio was very frugal and would often reuse cheap sets, which were hidden through the shadows used. In fact, the differing influences of everyone involved within the making of this film was what made it so interesting to learn about. In sharp contrast to the director-led New Hollywood era, Casablanca's director, Michael Curtiz, is as far from an auteur as you can get, as he only ever really did what he was told by the studios. That was so interesting to me, and really highlighted the fact that films back then were less so personal works of art and more so a mass-produced money game, which makes it all the more surprising that masterpieces like this film ended up coming out of it. Although, despite Curtiz not being an auteur director, there was still one auteur-like figure who I really enjoyed learning about: the executive producer, Hal B. Wallace. His role within this film was fascinating, as he was basically the one who made the most significant creative decisions related to how a sense of verisimilitude was maintained, and he was even responsible for writing the iconic final line.
I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
Casablanca was just a really unique film to learn the production history of, and some of the facts that I learnt about it helped to make the film more impressive in my mind. Seriously, the technical achievements of this film deserve a lot of praise, because they are honestly stellar. Why? Because around 98% of this movie was filmed in studio. Yeah! Everything you're seeing here wasn't filmed on location. It was filmed in studio. Somehow. Literally the only scene not filmed in the studio is Strauss's introduction on the plane. Apart from that, Everything else is artificial, but you honestly wouldn't be able to tell. I know I certainly didn't, and that is just so impressive. The set design is just fantastic and doesn't feel cheap at all. What also helps with this immersion are all of the little details and tricks present, which are made to help maintain this aforementioned verisimilitude. I mean, just look at the ending at the airport. You would normally assume that it was either filmed at a real airport, or it was at least filmed in a very large set. But it actually wasn't. Instead, the planes were miniature, and the actors stood beside them were actually dwarf actors chosen to create an illusion of greater size, which was aided alongside a ton of fog effects. This is such a clever way to hide your limitations, and it just makes me appreciate the successes of this film even more. Oh, and this genius decision was once again thanks to Hal B. Wallace, the true Giga Chad of the Casablanca production team. Sorry for geeking out so much, but I think this helps to give you an idea of how much I love studying this film, and how much I appreciate it more thanks to its technical attributes and little details. But remember, the ultimate reason for why Casablanca is rated so highly on this list is because it's one of the tightest and most well-realized films ever made. It's a masterpiece. Everyone knows it's a masterpiece. It's the quintessential romance film and one of the most deserved Best Picture winners ever. Just watch it, man. You won't regret it. Look, I love Some Like It Hot, and it probably would have been legendary to watch in class, I imagine. Although, to be fair, Casablanca is just as gay as Some Like It Hot, let's be honest with ourselves. But either way, Casablanca is definitely a better film, and it was still amazing to study as a bonus. Plus, it works really well in comparison to Bonnie and Clyde. Think about it. You've got a crowd-pleaser propaganda piece on one side, and a counterculture crime story on the other side. Perfectly contrasted, and easy to write about in an exam, and I am forever grateful for that. However, as amazing as this movie is, it didn't quite top my list.
Besides, no one's been stabbed here since Friday. There's not been a murder all day.
In a list filled with beloved staples of pop culture such as Inception and Casablanca, I never in a million years would have expected that the film should top my personal ranking would be an Argentinian anthology film. Yet here we are. Wild Tales is just a masterpiece, and is one of my favourite films. In fact, it's definitely in a comfortable spot in my top 50, which is something which can't actually be said for any of the other films on this list. This film just ticks all of the right boxes for me, and delivers an experience which I consistently find interesting, engaging, and incredibly entertaining, and you all need to watch it. However, I'll be honest, I'm really surprised that I'm this positive about this film, considering the fact that I'm not actually a big fan of anthology stories like this. I vastly prefer watching a film with a singular, continuous narrative, rather than a series of vignettes or multiple unrelated short stories tied together. It just makes the film harder for me to judge as a full package, and I often find that they are let down by the weaker and less interesting segments. The French Dispatch, for example, is an anthology film that I like enough, but it's let down by how dull I find the Timothée Chalamet story, which thus lets down the whole film. With Wild Tales, meanwhile, it actually works really well for me in spite of its anthology nature, and that's primarily down to two main reasons. Firstly, and most importantly, I think that all 6 stories are bangers. They do vary in terms of tone and runtime, but they are all nonetheless great to watch, primarily thanks to their compelling narratives and strong characters who you are able to connect with easily in just a few minutes. It's very inspiring to watch if you're in the process of making short films, like I am, as this film does a really effective job at telling stories within a short 20 or so minute runtime. But alongside being really well made, I think that this film works for me more than other anthologies because of the general tone of the stories told here. While some stories are a lot more comedic than others which are more serious, all of the stories nonetheless ride that beautiful line of dark comedy, which helps the film to remain really focused and consistent in how you're meant to feel about it, whilst also working really well for me because I love these kinds of dark comedy stories. These kinds of stories are able to tell compelling narratives with strong dramatic beats, whilst also being insanely entertaining and rewatchable for me, which thus makes me love them even more. If you want proof of my love for dark comedies, Parasite is one of my top 10 favourite films of all time, and Inside Number 9 is one of my top 3 favourite TV shows of all time, and both of them are dark comedies. In fact, Inside Number 9 is a really useful thing to bring up in relation to Wild Tales, because they are remarkably similar. Not only are the stories being told darkly comedic in tone, but Inside Number 9 is also an anthology TV show, with each season consisting of 6 episodes, which is the same number of stories as this film. So, watching Wild Tales is essentially like watching a season of Inside Number 9, and that is a really good thing in my eyes, because I will never say no to watching Number 9, or anything that reminds me of it, and Wild Tales certainly does give off the same vibe, even down to its sense of humour, which is surprisingly similar, despite being in a completely different continent from the UK. Either way, this film really does hit that sweet spot between hysterical scenarios and really dark and serious moments, and I was always engaged with every story, and every time one finished, I couldn't wait to see the next one. So yeah, it's clear this film just hit the spot for me thanks to the ways that the stories were told in regards to its tone and genre, and it's also quite inspiring when it comes to how it tells these compelling stories in such a short amount of time. However, all of these points are quite general and don't really cover the stories themselves, so in order for me to explain why I love the stories told here, I'm going to talk about and gush over all 6 of them briefly. So the first story that we've got is Pasternak, which is one of the most perfect ways to open a film, especially a film like this. It perfectly establishes what this whole film is going to be like, and I just knew as soon as it finished and the banger title music started playing that I was going to love this whole film. It's the shortest story by far, but in spite of its short length, it crafts a perfect little mystery with a brilliant twist and a humorous ending which left me simultaneously in awe and laughing in a really dark and twisted way, which is exactly what this film is all about. Although, it also establishes some of the main themes present throughout this entire film, such as with its showcase of revenge. However, I'll talk more about these themes a little bit later. Then after that, we've got Las Ratas, which is already a great parallel to Pasternak due to its radically different visual style. Instead of being squeaky clean and white, it feels dirty and grimy with these dark blue and green colours, which feel very horror-esque. In fact, that leads me on to a more general point. The visuals throughout this entire film are top notch, with stellar direction and cinematography, and a brilliant aesthetic quality which makes me understand perfectly why this film was chosen for the global cinema questions. Anyway, back to Las Ratas, this story also does a great job at establishing one of the other major themes of the film: corruption, and how that can damage people's lives, with Mozart losing her father to it whilst Cuenca gets rich as a result. Whilst this story may be a somewhat satisfying revenge tale, it's still got some darker elements to it, which makes it one of the more serious stories from the film. Although, by the film's end, it's not too upsetting to see Cocinera go to prison for stabbing Cuenca, because 1, the prick deserved it, and 2, Cocinera said that she actually preferred prison anyway. Still, this is overall a more serious story with a slightly imperfect ending. Which is then contrasted by the following story, The Strongest, which is very over the top and pretty humorous. First of all, I love the transition to this story. Most anthologies don't really have a tie between the stories, and instead do a simple fade to black, but between these two stories, vehicles are used as a way to transition between them. This sadly isn't a technique used elsewhere in this film, which is probably one of my few minor nitpicks with Wild Tales, but it was still really cool to see in one instance here. Anyway, The Strongest was a brilliant cautionary tale about the dangers of road rage and toxic masculinity, with these two idiots from different social classes getting into an unnecessarily drawn out and eventually fatal fight over highway disputes and a middle finger. I really loved how much this story built and built over time, as these relatively small events got more and more drastic, and the characters, especially our protagonists, became more and more unlikable as they made the situation worse for themselves. Both men could walk away from the situation which would make things better for them, but their entitlement and need to be the strongest causes them to keep fighting, which eventually leads to their deaths. Speaking of which, the ending punchline of the crime of passion was one of the most perfect notes to end on. But yeah, I really love this one, and this story specifically has actually really inspired me when it comes to my own creative projects. I love looking at stupid road rage and taking the piss out of toxic masculinity, so it's no wonder why this story works so well for me. Although at the same time, it was the most awkward story to watch in class because of, well, I'm not going to show it on YouTube, but there's a bit where the redneck guy, you know, took a shit on the windscreen. I don't really have the words to describe that. It was, it was something. It was certainly something. However, despite the fact that I love this story, it surprisingly wasn't actually my favourite of the 6 stories. The next one was Bombita. I fucking love this story so much. It is another story of revenge and corruption in a similar vein to Las Ratas, but it feels distinct due to showing it from a different perspective, with a wildly different and a slightly more uplifting ending. This story shows the impact that corruption can have on a normal professional everyman such as Simon, who is forced to deal with the BS of the towing companies, which is simultaneously a great commentary on the state of Argentinian society back when this film was released in 2014. But it's also the most relatable story by far, as, let's be honest, we've all had to deal with these annoying companies stealing from us and manipulating the situation to make things worse for us. This thus makes the story the most satisfying by far, as Simon, the pre-established demolitions expert, blows up the towing company like the Giga Chad that he is. And I just love this resolution, and I also love the ending where he celebrates his birthday in prison, and all the prisoners treat him with respect because they love what he did. Oh, it's so good. That moment brought me so much joy, not gonna lie, and was the cherry on top of this really interesting and entertaining story, and was a major reason for why it was my favourite by far. Although that wasn't the only reason for why I thought that this was the best story, as I also thought that it had the tightest script, which was able to pack in the most information in its short runtime. It effectively established Simon's character within the first few minutes as being really professional and respectable, which means that the rest of the story is more effective as we see him dragged lower and lower as the towers keep screwing him over. But alongside that, there's also a lot of interesting stuff with his wife, with a very even-handed conflict between the pair. Yes, Simon isn't the best guy around, as he does have a bit of a short temper, and is a bit of a workaholic, and his wife's points were valid to some extent, but at the same time, she's not entirely right either, as she's a bit ignorant to the fact that Simon needs to work a lot in order to survive in a society which is constantly trying to screw him over. I just thought that the subplot was quite even-handed and interesting, and it just gave the story even more substance. So yeah, I love Bombita, and if it was its own short film separate from the rest, it would still be one of my favourite shorts I've ever seen. And this satisfying and uplifting story is then cleverly contrasted with easily the most depressing story from this film. The Proposal. This is by far the most explicit criticism of Argentinian corruption, as we follow this rich family who are trying to pay the right lawyers to prevent their son from going to prison for killing a pregnant woman in a drunk driving incident. Instead of getting their son to own up to his horrible mistake, they try to pin the blame on their innocent groundskeeper. That's absolutely awful, and what's worse is the fact that the situation gets so out of hand that the son's own request to turn himself in is ignored, and the innocent groundskeeper is murdered by the pregnant woman's husband for a crime he didn't even commit. If it isn't obvious enough, this is easily the least enjoyable story, and is the only one that I wouldn't really call a comedy, as it doesn't really have any particularly funny moments. As a result of this fact, The Proposal is often ranked as the weakest story from this film for a lot of people, but honestly, I still loved it because I found it fascinating to watch, and its themes really stuck with me long after it finished. Yes, it's disgusting to see unfold, but it's still an incredibly engaging watch, and I liked how much more serious it was, as it gave the film more variety, and really hammered home all of the themes present. Anyway, now we've got the final story. Till Death Do Us Part. Once again, I love the way that the stories were paired together. The shocking murder at the end of The Proposal is then suddenly contrasted with a vibrant wedding and the song Titanium at the start of this story. Some may find this to be a bit of a tone whiplash, but I personally think that it works in the context of this film and helps to immediately establish a brand new tone for a new story. Anyway, this story was a brilliant way to end the film. It's clear from the marketing of Wild Tales that Till Death Do Us Part was the poster story, which the creators really wanted everyone to look forward to. And it certainly delivered with an incredibly humorous and wonderfully dark story of a wedding gone very, very wrong in all of the best ways imaginable. The best way to describe this story is just pure chaos. It starts out somewhat normally with a bride discovering her new husband is cheating on her during a wedding, and so she storms off to cry. But then things start to go crazy when she boinks the chef, threatens to ruin the groom's life, returns to the wedding, nearly kills the side partner by chucking her in the window, and then makes a big scene which everyone is now aware of. Okay, what just happened here? I don't really know, but I'm absolutely loving it. This is textbook number 9 right here, and I couldn't be happier. But I think the reason for why I like this story and the direction it takes is thanks to the way that the conflict between the characters are presented. Yes, Ariel is a cheating scumbag who deserved some of the retribution, but Romina also made the situation way worse, with her revenge plan being something truly despicable, even before she dragged other people down into her revenge. In my mind, by the end of the story, she became just as bad as Ariel. And that's funny, because it shows that these two are truly made for each other. And that's what leads to the hilarious ending where the two actually somehow get back together and make out next to the cake. Look, I know a lot of people didn't like this ending, but I thought it was legendary and it fit with the batshit insane nature of this story. It may be a Johnny Depp Amber Heard marriage, but it nonetheless gave us a memorable ending to this film. If I ever get married, I want to make the wedding look exactly like the one here, because I am an awful person. And those are all of the stories present in Wild Tales. I hope my constant gushing will make it pretty clear how much I love the entirety of this film, no matter what it focused on. Every story is interesting in their own way, and I just love the variety present within them, as well as the sheer high quality of the writing and filmmaking on display here. But I think the stories rarely work as well as they do, because they're put into the whole package of this film, as we're able to see these main themes of corruption and revenge in new lights depending on what part we're watching. As an example, a lot of the stories show the ugly side of revenge, where it gets innocent people hurt, like in Pasternak or The Proposal, or it makes a situation worse than it needs to be, like in Death Do Us Part. But there's also stories like Bombita, which shows a more positive side of revenge, where it actually makes a difference for the better, as the corruption of the towing company is called into question. This gives the film a lot more variety, and it really works well within the anthology nature of the film, because the different stories can provide a more even-handed look at these different themes. And as for the theme of corruption, I liked how it was subtly implemented into certain stories. Obviously it's quite explicit in Las Ratas and The Proposal and whatnot, but it's still got a threshold in many other stories, such as Till Death Do Us Part, where Romina aimed to use the corrupt system of Argentina as a way to screw over her husband. Even Bombita, an explicit commentary on corruption, had some subtler details related to this theme, such as with the wife's divorce lawyer, who was very clearly speaking on behalf of her client in an attempt to screw over Simon as much as possible. I was surprised on my latest rewatch by how terrible and corrupt this lawyer actually was, because she was really trying to take away Simon's daughter against the wishes of his wife. She even looked surprised and upset when the suggestion was made. It's a great subtle detail which gives that story even more to it, and really helps with one of the major themes of the film. I could honestly go on and on about this film all day, but I think I'm going to have to end things here as I'm going to need to wrap up this video soon. Overall though, Wild Tales is a masterpiece, and it's easily my favourite film on this list because it just appeals to my taste the most. It's got the perfect tone that I love to see, it was able to maintain my engagement throughout in spite of the anthology nature of the film, and it's got so much to talk about. Admittedly, I don't really have much to say in regards to my experience of studying Wild Tales in class, as aesthetics aren't really the most interesting thing to talk about when it comes to why I love a film overall, as I tend to focus more of my attention on the themes and whatnot. But still, I'm glad that we studied it, because I know for a fact that I would have never come across it if I wasn't studying it for this course. And I also imagine that a lot of you probably haven't seen this film either, so this is my reminder for you all to please watch this film, because you will not regret it. It is an underrated gem which deserves a hell of a lot more attention than it's got. I love it to bits, and, in spite of how much I had to write about it, it is the film I would be the most inclined to rewatch now that my exams are over. Without a doubt, my favourite film from this list. And that was my list. Bloody hell, that took a while. I hope you enjoyed watching this very, very long video. I know that I certainly enjoyed making it, as it was really fun to reflect on my work over the past 2 years. I know this is a bit of a different video from my usual output, but I thought it'd be interesting nonetheless, and hopefully it also worked as a nice little appetizer for you all before the big ranking coming in the future, which will rank every film nominated for Best Animated Feature. Yes, I am still doing that video as progress is coming along pretty nicely, but it will still take a long ass time to finish, so please be patient with me. Speaking of which, thank you guys so much for being patient with me when it comes to uploads. I know I've barely uploaded any proper length videos this year, but hopefully this nice meaty ranking will help to make up for the recent drought of videos, and I really hope that the upcoming ranking will be satisfying for you all. Anyway, that's all I've got left to say for now. Go and watch Wild Tales, take care, and have a wonderful day. Goodbye everyone!